Network, it gives me an immense pleasure to welcome you for the opening of the conference on Evidence for Development South Asia 2021. As you must be aware that this event precedes the annual global event, What Works Global Summit, Evidence for Development, being held in October this year. And the decision to call this conference at a regional and more so at a South Asian level was taken in the May this year. And one of the main motivation was to provide a platform for South Asian researchers, or decision makers, and experts in the field of international development for discussion on improving our understanding on how evidence can support policies for transformation in South Asian region. It is now well understood and well documented that to be able to develop effective strategies in international development, there has to be an increased emphasis for generating sound evidence regionally as well as globally. But having evidence in itself is not sufficient. It is equally important to know the quality of the evidence, it's relevant to the context where it is used, and also importantly, how this evidence is being used and who are the users of this evidence. Thanking our esteemed speakers in the program who are uniquely placed to discuss and highlight some of these points in the opening plenary and the keynote address. The second motivation for this conference was to provide an opportunity for South Asian researchers to present their work in the various parallel sessions happening over the 2 days of the conference. This would provide an opportunity for them to engage in the research community across South Asia, to receive constructive feedback from the experts in the region on their work, and also to build new collaborations for their research projects. I would like to mention, we are fortunate to have support of our sponsors, Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research, Gender Platform. And I would also like to thank our partners, JPAL South Asia's Regional Center, who graciously agreed to put together an engaging panel scheduled later today. I would keep it short, and I sincerely hope you will enjoy these 2 days of discussion and networking, and thank you once again for your participation and support. Before we begin with the official opening of the conference with our opening plenary, I would like to announce that we would be using chat for the Q&A. So I would request you all to kindly refrain from using chat for any other information and greetings. If you face any issues,
Ashrita, I think you've gone on mute.
You are on mute. Yeah, we lost you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Sorry. So as I was mentioning that all of you will have the opportunity to interact with other researchers and build network, and also share links of your work in the virtual coffee break that we have through chats and also by unmuting yourself. So at this stage, I would like to introduce our chair for the opening plenary, Generation and Use of Evidence in South Asia, Fostering Collaborations, for the formal opening of the conference. Professor Pierre Jacquet is the president of Global Development Network. He was formerly the chief economist of the French Development Agency between 2002 and 2012. He also served as the executive director in charge of strategy from 2002 and 2010. Preceding the French Development Agency, he was the deputy director of the French Institute of International Relations. From 1994 to 2012, Pierre Jacquet was the president of Department of Economics and Social Sciences and professor of international economics at a renowned French graduate engineering school. He has also lectured in various business schools and universities such as Sciences Po, the Paris School of Economics, and École Nationale Administration. Professor Pierre, it is my pleasure to welcome you, and over to you now.
Thank you very much, Ashrita. Good morning, everybody. As Ashrita mentioned, it's a pleasure for me to open this joint Campbell Collaboration GDN conference on evidence for development South Asia 2021 with a very distinguished panel. And as Ashrita mentioned, it's a precursor to the E4D Evidence for Development event, What Works Global Summit, which is going to take place from the 18th to the 27th of October in a few weeks. So our task this morning is to set the stage and discuss the generation use of evidence in South Asia. And to guide us through this discussion, we have a panel of 5 distinguished speakers from various professional origins, and all of them have a lot of experience. I would like to present them very briefly, and I hope that the full CVs are available on the website, and I'll do that by alphabetical order. Maria Bishker, who leads the research and evaluation team at UNICEF India and leads UNICEF's external capacity building efforts in monitoring and evaluation, supporting partnerships for evidence across all UNICEF programmatic domains. Dr. Imran Imran, an economist who is the executive director of BRAC and leads the BRAC Institute of Governance and Development, BIGD. He also serves as the country director of the International Growth Center in Bangladesh, and has an extensive experience both in development thinking and in concrete development work. Dr. Ranjita Pusku, who is the country representative for India of the International Rice Research Institute, IRI, and leads the evidence module in the new CGIAR gender platform. And gender here means, of course, attention to gender, but also it means generating evidence and new directions for equitable results. And she has an extensive experience in developing programs on gender and impact and taking them to scale. Dr. Renu Singh, who is the country director of Young Lives in India, the executive director and founder of Young Life Research to Policy Center, with a lot of experience on policy research related to children and youth and education, and more specifically early childhood. And Professor Dr. Howard White, Chief Executive Officer of Campbell Collaboration and co-organizer of this event with GDN. It's my pleasure to have you here, Howard. He was previously the founding executive director of the International Initiative for Impact Evaluations, 3IE, and he has also led the impact evaluation program of the World Bank's independent evaluation group. So now the generation and careful consideration of evidence is at the core of GDN's interest and mission. However, to initiate this panel discussion, I will try to play a little bit the devil's advocate and challenge some of the premises I believe we work with. And this interrogation that I have, I put to the panelists. My main concern, I think, is that we tend to focus on evidence as a product rather than a process. We see it as a packaged, rigorous piece of knowledge about what works. And we are, of course, naturally concerned about the use of that evidence, or actually the insufficient use. However, I think this misrepresents policy, and it misrepresents many decision processes beyond the policy world as well. Policy, unfortunately, maybe, is not about applying what works. It is in building political consensus around types of actions, and then it is about implementing decisions under much uncertainty. And that uncertainty inevitably leads to question and reframe at least parts of the initial decisions. So what matters, therefore, is how things are implemented and work to produce results, probably more than the results themselves. My first question to our panelists is therefore about whether and how they look at implementation processes as opposed or complementary to results. As long as results remain the outcome of political processes which we do not analyze enough, we cannot really conclude from evaluative research that the actions that produce these results work in the absolute. This means that the kind of evidence we should push and cherish is one about how things work or don't work, and why. And we should focus on the processes through which evidence can actually be considered better in the decision-making process. I actually support some of the work in the recent social science literature on evidence that recommends a conceptual shift from the notion of evidence-based policy to that of evidence-informed politics. More often than not, however, decision makers brandish their own interpretation of evidence in support of pre-established positions and beliefs. This use of evidence is a fundamental dimension that shouldn't be ignored and should be built on. There is also some irony in today's world characterized by various challenges to rationality and scientific knowledge to discuss research based on evidence about what works. Unfortunately, scientific research is increasingly challenged as the monopoly producer that it was earlier of meaningful evidence. It seems, therefore, that one overwhelming question for all of us is about how to restore the credibility and power of research-based evidence in a market for what I would call claimed evidence, in which there is unfair competition from many non-scientific sources. And the key of the competition, unfortunately, is not the soundness of what it produces. I would also like the panelists to address this set of issues. Can we still be confident that we are in a world that can be driven by evidence? And then all questions come up. What is the evidence we are talking about? What does it mean to use it? Who should produce it and how? And so on. Let me stop there and immediately give the floor to our panelists. I will again follow the alphabetical order because all of them have to contribute in their own way. And my first one is Mike. Mike, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Pierre. I think you've asked some very big existential questions, which I think we need more than an hour to discuss. But I think you raised some really important questions, and I'll try through the opening points that I wanted to share some examples address in one way. I think what I wanted to anchor in, and I think that's very relevant also to some of the opening questions you asked, is COVID, because I think we've seen with the uncertainty around COVID, in my opinion, a little bit of a shift in the way that we also look at evidence, and especially for what we have done in UNICEF. I think that we have seen that that has really pushed us to deal with some of the questions that you have actually asked. What is the process of doing it, and how do we actually use some of this evidence? And I think it's also really important for us because COVID is, of course, the new reality that we live in. And for us, as UNICEF and a rights-based organization, it's really also about reducing the vulnerabilities and inequalities that have been exacerbated as a result. And here I think it's interesting. I was going to use evidence-based policymaking. It becomes even more important, but perhaps you're right. It's more evidence-informed politics that is more important for us to actually make sure that we're able to address some of those inequities that we see exacerbated because of COVID. I think what I'll just anchor this in and give you some examples, and I'm going to talk about two parts, partnership and use, is that we have invested substantially in supporting monitoring, evaluation, and evidence during COVID, and we really focused on trying to develop rapid, relevant, and more or less, and we can debate that, robust evidence around what's happening to women, children, adolescents, and on the ground, what solutions, and also to think of what solutions are needed in the COVID context. And as a result, we undertook a lot of rapid assessments in the region, in the South Asia region, around understanding the situation of women and children. And we've actually recently documented this, so I can share a link to that. We've created a report with case studies from India, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka about what we've learned through our efforts to try and actually do this evidence generation around the COVID situation. And importantly here, we focused on the how of generating evidence. So really it's the process. We don't really look at, okay, what were the findings, etc. We really looked at what did we do, why did we do it, and how did we do it? And we don't just focus on the technical dimensions of design, remote data collection, etc. We have really important dimensions that we analyzed around partnerships and how did we actually use this evidence. And I think I just wanted to touch on two of those subjects or those topics so that because I think they're important. So on the partnerships piece, because I think partnerships and use is really important. Without partners, I don't think you can have, a full uptake of a lot of the findings. What we saw is that we really needed to select our partners strategically. There are trade-offs of working with different partners, whether it's our civil society organizations, our academic research organizations, government, or even in our case, other UN agencies and donors. And we realized that we could tap into a lot of the technical expertise and networks and resources of local partners for local data collection, such as community volunteers to recruit participants on the ground. We use telephonic databases to reach people. But we also realized working with pseudo-government or government-supported institutions actually meant that we had greater access to secondary data, which otherwise we may not have access to, things like MIS, government-related data. And I think that was something that we realized quite consciously. Also, direct partnerships with government. We had a couple of cases where the government literally reached out to us and said, we want to do this study because we don't know what's happening and we want UNICEF to support, which helps because the buy-in is already there and they are already ready to use it. However, at the other end, we have the trade-offs in terms of, well, how quickly can we then make sure that we can do a lot of the implementation? It takes a lot of time. Often government needs to review everything. And then there's also a point about often we realized there was a bit of a trade-off in terms of whether or not we could publish some of these findings publicly, because there were political sensitivities around data. And then I think we also were able to learn a lot about that. For us, it wasn't just about collaborating just in our own context. We realized the real value of collaborating between regions across different UN agencies, in our case, donors. We had ability to mobilize more funding, access more technical capabilities we couldn't otherwise, but it also meant there were many cooks cooking on the same study, and it meant that we had to sort of trade off the timeliness of that. I think other points on use, and then I'll close it because I know I have only 5 minutes. We used a lot of this evidence for our own programming and advocacy. We used a lot of it to help inform government planning and guidelines in responding to COVID. But I think the key that we learned was planning. And I think that's also part of the process. When we were faced with this unprecedented situation, a lot of our evidence generation was reactive. We thought, okay, quickly, we need to generate this, and didn't necessarily strategically at that point think about, well, how are we actually going to use it? Which audience members need what information in what form so that we can actually inform them? And also importantly, which are the partners that we need to bring on board at the very beginning so that we have already set sort of the context for use, that the stakeholders that we want to act upon are actually already involved and collaborating on this at the beginning. And I think, again, that point about having those trade-offs in our head, one of the main things we spent a lot of time discussing is some of our government partners did not want the data to be public. Were we okay with that? If that meant that policy was going to change, that programming was going to be implemented, that actually a scheme was going to be adapted so that more children could access food or social protection support. And I think the other thing that we also realized through this is knowledge management and the importance of knowledge management. And I think this is also a question that I have about, well, what is evidence actually, if you think about it? Are there different sort of gradations in evidence that we can use, and what information can we use very quickly, which is good enough for that context? And then how do we invest in sort of more robust evidence generation in the longer term? And I think I'll sort of stop there. I had some other reflection, but I'll stop there, that actually, if I may also be a devil's advocate a little bit, a challenge we really found was, how do we actually track whether the evidence that we produced from these rapid assessment was used? I asked a lot of colleagues and said, can you tell me how this has been used? And they sort of went, I don't know what you're asking me. Like, how do we define that actually this has been taken up? And it isn't as unidirectional, I think, as you said, Pierre, is we have the evidence and you have now done what the recommendation said. I think it's far more complicated than that. And I think that box is what we need to try and unpack. And I think as long as it's on the table and considered as an input in decision making, I think to me that already qualifies as use. So I'll stop it there because I think I'll stick to my 5 minutes that I've been given. Thank you, Pierre.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mike. And you have set the model to follow and to emulate of telling us a lot of deep things while keeping within your 5 minutes allocation. My next speaker is Imran. Imran, the floor is yours.
Hi. Sorry for my very colorful background behind me. I'm actually, sitting in a office of BRAC out in the field. So connection also challenging. Let's try. So, so first of all, Pierre, I think just sort of listening to you and the kind of questions that you've raised, I think sort of extremely refreshing because I think for quite some time, I think we have been really, I think having a very simplistic approach and a very simplistic model in terms of how this whole evidence to policy bridge, if you like, and the pathways to evidence, kind of works for policy. And I think this whole focus on not so much on policy, but much more on politics, I think is absolutely the right way to think about it. But then you immediately get to the point of what does that mean for the kind of evidence that one basically generates. So there's a whole politics of evidence generation as well that also needs to be then, I think, addressed. And I think that politics of evidence generation over time has been influenced by a very simplistic evidence to policy assumption. So without challenging the politics of evidence generation, it's very difficult to get to evidence to politics, or that whole equation formed. And I think the thinking there then needs to, I think, move beyond gold standard ideas of rigor to a much more use case oriented approach to rigor. Think much more about reasoned intuition. We're borrowing from Kaushik Basu's thinking in this space, and then thinking about a portfolio approach in terms of how one sort of addresses this whole process question about sort of evidence. And I think those are really important if you want to make progress in this trajectory, which I think is extremely important. Now, just a few kind of slightly more formed, kind of points that I would like to make. So the first is, I think one may think about, the whole evidence, politics, policy, this whole equation in terms of policy choice, policy implementation, and policy uptake. And I think one can think about, one could use a kind of a principal agent framework to look at, these different, sort of domains. I mean, I think in the domain of policy choice, it's really the citizen who is really the principal, and politicians are really the agent. Now I think this is the space where I think the way we've been thinking about evidence informing the politics of policy choice has been driven by a very, I think not a very citizen-oriented approach to policy choice. So I think here the big challenge is what is the type of evidence we need to generate, and how we generate that evidence that can empower citizens to actually inform citizenry, to basically get them citizens to sort of hold politicians to account in terms of policy choice, because ultimately politicians are responding to citizens. The citizens are really the principle in terms of the policy choice. So I think we need to rethink about how we think about evidence in the policy choice domain. I think that is needed. I think we are far clearer in terms of how evidence works around policy implementation, particularly policy implementation point. I think we have made much more progress in that space. Again, but I think in terms of policy uptake, and this is where it's the citizen who becomes the agent, because there are certain types of behavior, there's certain types of actions citizens need to take to be able to get the results of a particular policy in place. In that domain, I think we need some fresh thinking as well. I think it's still being very driven by behavioral economists and behavioral science and behavioral thinking. I think there are different ways of thinking about this as well. We need to think beyond individual agency to collective agency here as well, both in terms of policy choice and also in terms of policy uptake as well. So I think that's the kind of one framework through which I would like to I sort of my sort of thinking in terms of the questions that basically raised. The second is around learning state, right, or learning bureaucracy. If you think about bureaucracy as an organization, then I think the critical question is, how do we really create a learning-oriented bureaucracy? Do we know When does bureaucracy learn? How does bureaucracy learn? What are the examples, good examples where that has actually happened and where it hasn't happened? I think that's really, really important. I think I have worked my whole life in a kind of NGO type of setting, in a very fortunate to be working in an NGO where there is a learning culture that is part and parcel of his DNA. Now that is not to be taken for sort of guaranteed in terms of in sort of other kind of context. So something we need to really understand. If you want to create a more learning-oriented bureaucracy, we need to understand how bureaucracy learns and also how bureaucracy actively not learn. Unlearning is as important, for bureaucracy. So actually, the not learning is really not having an inability to learn. Not learning is as active a process as learning. Bureaucracy often wants to maintain status quo and really focuses on not learning. And I think we need to really understand again how that happens and what are the entry points to be able to create a more learning oriented bureaucracy culture. So I think those are the kind of two thoughts, if you like, I had listening to you and also reading what you basically wrote. I can come back later with some more concrete examples from my own experience, working with BRAC and working with other think tank organizations in the COVID context, in terms of the rapid research work that we've been embarking on. But I will reserve that perhaps later at that time. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Imran. Let me just say a few things here, especially about learning, because I have the impression that there is a sort of tension between various expected uses of evidence. One is about accountability. The other one is about learning. And of course, there is a third one, which is about creating some knowledge about what development is about. But we are sometimes focusing a lot on accountability. And when we do that, we want independent production of evidence. And that runs against the spirit of partnership that Mike was mentioning. If we want organizations and people to learn, they have to be part of the production of evidence, because if not, that evidence will not look legitimate to them, and they will not have any incentives to look at it and learn from it. So there is this tension that I think maybe we need several words to distinguish between several potential users of evidence. And this is for me still a very much open question. Well, thank you very much indeed. Next speaker is Ranjita. Ranjita, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks, Pierre. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for the very challenging questions that you've posed. I'll focus today on issues related to evidence generation and use based on the CGIAR experience in the context of agriculture food systems in the region and promoting gender equality in that arena. While gender equality is an area that we all have acknowledged as being very important for a few decades now, we haven't really been able to move the dial on this much, particularly in South Asia. Malnutrition, hunger, poverty, they all persist, and drivers like climate change and the ongoing pandemic, they've all demonstrated how fragile our food systems and the associated gender equality are. We all seem to recognize that women have a key role to play in addressing this, and several NGOs and civil society organizations have been doing their bit, working with women to actually realize their role as change agents, rather than just being stereotyped as the victims of all these changes and drivers. However, I wonder if policy might have yet provided the enabling support that is needed to accelerate that pace of change. Policy is not the only way to address issues related to gender equality. Given the social complexities, the very constraining, sticky social gender norms that we face in most parts of this region, but policy can and does play a role if we get it right. And then to do that, we would say, hey, we need good evidence. And we all know how thin gender evidence is. And this has been flagged as a priority by major donors, international agencies, even the governments in the region recognize that. While evidence is being generated slowly, there is a lot to reflect on what is working and not working in generating the type and quality of evidence that is needed, influence not just policy, but development practice, research, and political processes, as you say. One begins to wonder, do we really understand the questions policymakers or politicians are seeking answers to in this area of gender equality, which can be quite contentious? Are they even looking for evidence? Or is it just something that needs to be done to be politically correct and respond to donor pressures? I won't generalize and say we are not doing enough on that front across the board. I mean, nutrition and health sector has used evidence more effectively than others. Increasingly, we are seeing evidence on the gender dimensions of poverty. Thanks to JPAL, also the 2019 Nobel Prize, Banerjee, Duflo, and Kramer, which highlighted the importance of this. Evidence on women and labor markets is emerging rapidly. I mean, looking forward to the session that we have in the conference tomorrow. The World Bank South Asia Gender Innovation Lab is also beginning to generate evidence now. And I think if you look at the region, Bangladesh has been a lot more responsive to evidence and shaping their policies and programs based on that. And there's a lot to learn from there. I mean, when I look at India, I haven't seen much evidence of that happening here yet. I mean, and India has actually had a long tradition of planning, since after independence through the Planning Commission, but we might still be lacking the rigor that's needed in the process. The quality of evidence used, the standards are quite patchy. And since 2015, we have Niti Aayog, which is the think tank and supposed to be the evidence broker to help shape evidence-based policies and programs. But how do they engage with the political processes? And it might actually be too early to say how successful or not they have been. We do see, if we look at the processes, still very weak links between evidence generation, communication, and policy making, and then policy implementation and evaluation, point that Micah just mentioned. We don't know who is using it for what purpose and what impact it is actually leading to. And then a question I keep asking as we are engaging as the CGIAR in this process of, generating evidence and, trying to synthesize and communicate it. Do we actually have the capacity we need to produce the evidence in the region? I think we do. We do produce a lot of evidence, but it's patchy. It's all over the place. Doesn't really add up. So we end up having to make very special efforts to do that, to answer specific questions that these policymakers and politicians might need and use. And the information overload is also a major concern. How does one sift through it and not end up just cherry picking? And I think as we, have this discussion, a few things to ponder on. The methodologies that we use for evidence generation are part of this process. Ideally, we should be using longitudinal, multidisciplinary, mixed method studies. There was this famous study in Uttar Pradesh, in Palampur, over decades. And it wasn't just about the way evidence was generated, it was also about how they engaged with policymakers constantly to get that, evidence be considered and used in some of the policy decisions. But there are very few multidisciplinary studies these days. I mean, even if we look at the recent example, the responses to COVID in the form of lockdowns, very much based on epidemiological models that we used. Yes, important, we needed to do that, but these models only considered the disease side of things and didn't incorporate the social, economic, and psychological costs of the various actions. And we did see the fallout. And then there was, we kept going back and forth, and then, there was second wave. So, okay, there were no right answers, I guess, at this point in that situation. But I guess, as you said, PA, in one of our conversations, assessing the risks of certain actions which are emanating from the evidence, that we are producing, what needs to be done or what has worked, it should, I think, be an important focus. Then I say, hey, are we well equipped in terms of methods, capacities to do those kinds of assessment as part of the evidence that we generate? There are several examples in the region, Bangladesh, India, where evidence has been, used as a basis for designing a few social, development programs, and then, have had some successes, have been scaled out and so on. But what's really important, and I think, is understanding the purpose of evidence generation. Who are we producing it for? Who's asking for it? How do we think they will receive it? What kind of political experiences and interests and ideologies, how do they play out as compared to the development interests? And important is, how are we communicating this evidence? How many of these people, particularly when you talk about politicians, are going to read research papers, or briefs that we produce? Op-eds, blogs, social media is something to look at. I mean, if you look at India, I believe there's like 926 TV channels, which have become a huge influence, and they sway opinions of citizens and politicians and so on. So how do we deal with that? How do we engage with these constituencies to make sure it is robust, neutral evidence that actually gets to where it should get to? I think I'll stop with that, and then we can, discuss some examples in the discussion to follow. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed for introducing a set of new and important questions in the debate. Let me invite all the participants to use the chat to share their views, comments, and ask questions if they want, so that we can have a lively discussions in a few minutes. The next speaker is Renu. Renu, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks, Pierre. Hello to everyone, and thank you for setting up this panel and for all the insights we've heard so far. I'm just going to pick up from what I think both Dr. Imran and Ranjita just said. I think the key question here is, who is producing the evidence? Is evidence making as political as policy making? And I think that's what I believe there is politics in both, because it's very important to understand that if we look at South Asia and we look at the World Bank figures on the research and development expenditure as percentage of GDP in South Asia, it's 0.64 in 2018. Yeah, this is against, and India, for example, and I'll take India specifically. The research and development percentage of the GDP has been stagnant at about 0.6 to 0.7% for the last 2 decades, far less than the 2.19% spent even by China. So, the question is, so who's generating the evidence in South Asia? Who's funding the evidence? So often it is people, it's bilateral organizations, it's UN agencies. Many think tanks in these countries do not want to actually take money from government because you want to remain, independent. So then the question is, when this evidence is produced, and I think Imran actually talked about it. So we always talk about uptake, right? And then we talk about research uptake, yeah. But what about the downtake? What about the side take? Yeah, because it's not one way. Yeah, as researchers, the first people who we reach out to are researchers, right? Other colleagues in the same communities, because that's the natural way to go, yeah. And we share our research. The key question here is, Are we even developing that plurality within the community of researchers? Are we actually engaging and collaborating to develop this and generate this robust evidence? Because no one policy think tank or research organization can actually be sufficiently equipped to say, I have all the evidence. I firmly believe that. We've been running a longitudinal study in 4 countries for the last 22 years, in Peru, Ethiopia, Vietnam, and India. Yes, we use mixed methods, Ranjita. We do engage with policymakers right from questionnaire development, which is vetted at each survey round. We just finished, 3 rounds of telephone surveys instead of the 6 field survey. But can I ever, when people ask me, especially our funders, ask us, tell us what is your contribution to policy making. It's so difficult to talk about attribution because you may be contributing a small amount, but you cannot at any point affirmatively say that, this is because of our work. It can never be like that. Yeah. So I think it's, and of course, I think the politics of policy making, which, Pierre talked about right in the beginning, so important to understand. Each country, each government, each state government in our country, I'm talking of India, is different. It's the bureaucrats, it's the people at the helm at a particular point who are either going to be open to evidence or not. If they either going to be open to your evidence or not. Often you get the doors closed because they don't like the kind of research you might do, right? So I think it's so important to understand, that it's not an easy process. It's murky. You're talking of, well, at times, the same, a bureaucrat in a particular position may say immediately pass a government order because you've come out with certain evidence. And we've had that happen. You have a paper on, looking at quality of education, and you found through your regression analysis, what feedback is come up in immediate feedback, which was all about just checking whether books of children were corrected on time, is a huge contributory factor to children's achievement levels. Immediately you have a bureaucrat saying, okay, let's make a government order. What do you think we can do? Can this be part of the inspection that is done of the schools? Can we go and make sure that we open school, books? Because she asked me, how did you check this? Well, we went and we opened the books to see how many books were corrected and how many were up to date. Well, can this become part of the inspection regime? So policy making is also not just legislation, it's also these directives, because these can actually change quality of life, of children on the ground. And I think it's these small, directives, these small government orders, that's equally important when we're looking at the realm of policy influencing that we talk about. So I think I would just say that, I think it's very important for us to look back and say that, okay, so is research, like Mikey said, where they worked with a lot of partners on the ground because of COVID and they needed quick evidence to be generated. The question is, yes, I think it's really important to have partners on the ground, build their capacities to, to collect data with rigor. We've often found just data entry with partners becomes a nightmare. And I'm saying this with huge humility because it is also our, I think, responsibility to make sure that we work with partners and build capacities to do research. But also, I think as researchers, how we reach out to media, how we reach out to with the products that we produce. I mean, do we have these very complicated, regressions and presented to the policymakers? They're not going to read them. So are they even accessible products that we produce? I think we also need to reflect back on that as well. I'm going to stop because I can just go on and on.
Thank you very much. Well, a cynical view would say that if the evidence that is produced goes along with the prior assumptions and desires of policymakers, they will be willing to look at any regression. Let's not lose this cynical approach of policymaking, because I think it's real. I think policymakers look for the kind of evidence that serves their own priors. And this is part of the democratic debate. So I'm not sure we should even oppose that, but we should understand that process to feed the evidence that we need to actually influence it. Thank you very much, Renu. Very important questions as well. Howard, you are next and last before mutualizing this discussion.
Oh, thank you, Pierre, and thank you everyone else for your valuable and useful contributions. So it's come up a couple of times about what we mean by evidence. And what we commonly say in the field of research is that, well, the type of research we do should fit the research question. And I think everyone agrees to that. The other point that's been made, which is also relevant, is that there are other types of evidence as well, other than research evidence. And so public opinion polls, which inform politicians about voter priorities or values, basically. When we look at decision-making, we say that all values have to be part of the decision-making process, and opinion polls are one way of doing that. And then the other thing that's come up is, of course, the role of the media. So traditionally newspapers, and newspapers remain important in India. Politicians, decision-makers read for newspapers every day when they go to work or on the way to work, and then increasingly social media, and of course these television shows that have been mentioned already, which are hectoring at one point or another. They're quite remarkable. My landlady, where I stay in Delhi, has one of the particular channels on continuously, and it's very, very hectoring. But the press is important. So moving away from India, the BBC this morning had a report for the UK on peer-to-peer sexual abuse in children. And sexual abuse is a good example of an issue that would normally come first through the newspapers and then probably get picked up by government, and maybe there'd be some government inquiries around child sexual exploitation. And then it starts to move in the research literature. And politicians will pick it up once it's in the media. So, and child sexual exploitation is a good example of an issue that no one really spoke much about 10 years ago, and is now a major issue for many agencies. And so you see this trajectory of where evidence comes from. So it makes its way actually from media, politicians get interest, and then the research in the area grows. So research actually often lags what are the areas of policy interest rather than leads them. So that's about types of evidence. I could say much more about that. I won't say much more. So one point about, of course, the media reports are they're local, and there's a real primacy policymakers give to local evidence. And as Campbell, believing international evidence informing local policy, we don't agree with that. But I do know working with policymakers, they'll say, oh, but their evidence is from from Mozambique, show me the Asian evidence. And you'll say, well, then they'll say, well, that's from Bangladesh, show me the Indian evidence. And they'll say, oh, but that's from Kerala, show me the evidence for AP. And they'll say, oh, but that's for this particular district, on the evidence from this district. Oh, no, that's from this village. Oh, I'm in this village. So they get really very local in however they want their evidence to be. And part of that is that we need to educate people that know, okay, you can look for evidence elsewhere. Evidence can be transferable, and that's an important area of research, understanding the transferability of evidence. But an important part of that has come up is, I think it was Rajita that mentioned it, is who produces the knowledge. Yes, and so I think local production of knowledge is important. You're much more right to have co-production if it's done locally, and an important part of evidence use is having trusted sources of knowledge, and trusted sources of knowledge are much more likely to be local researchers. And if you look at, I'm an economist, so you look at the supply and demand side for evidence, the supply side for evidence is in India is very strong. You have a huge research community, huge research base. You have numerous universities, and then you have more and more universities coming up with the growth of private universities. So, and then beyond those, you have every state has a government-funded social science research centre, for example, and then you have the international organizations present in India, like IFPRI, Population Council, and so on. And then the particular area of effectiveness, which of course the area that I've worked in the last 10 years or so. You've had JPAL for a number of years working with Pratam, but other agencies and governments. You've had 3IE now in Delhi for over 10 years. You've got the Campbell South Asia set up more recently. So there's a huge presence, research presence in India. It's not a lack of research being done. And then there are sector-specific institutes like ICMR and so on. So there's lots of stuff going on. And so it's not a lack of evidence being produced. It's a question of then, well, one is what's the quality? And there are serious quality issues. So I've been a journal editor for a couple of journals, and one issue is basically for most journals, half the papers you publish never get cited by anybody. And so you're concerned about your impact factor, half the papers you publish don't get cited at all. And if you go to regional journals, the lack of citations is even more common. So even other researchers aren't reading your research. So forget about policymakers aren't reading the research, researchers aren't reading the research. And so it is a question of doing relevant research that's of sufficient quality to people take notice of it and think it's worth citing and have trust in the findings. But it's also about thinking about the demand side. And the demand side for evidence comes from, I'm looking at demand side for 3 points. There's government, there's CSOs, and there's the public. And Imran touched on this. I think the press can play an important part in helping the public think, oh, we need evidence. So when a statement is made, people ask, well, where's the evidence? And the press should be playing that role. Investigative journalism should be playing that role. Well, this policy is being done. Where's the evidence for it? What's the evidence say? Next are CSOs. So India has a very vibrant NGO community for many, many years. That's a great thing. But of course, it'd be better if it was more evidence-based. And we have some notable examples. I've mentioned Pratam already. When I was at 3IE, we funded some studies being done by Breakthrough. But more and more NGOs thought, well, we'd like to make our program evidence-based. Of course, the big player is, of course, government, both nationally and down at the state governments. And they are pretty much an evidence-free zone. So and it's not because there's no history of monitoring and evaluation. India has a huge history of monitoring and evaluation. It's the norm for evaluation reports to be commissioned to projects, not the exception. But I call them telephone directory reports. So they do surveys, they go and collect lots of data, and then you have a report that tabulates every single piece of information they've collected and describes every table they've collected. This number is 63.2. This number is 36.7. That's lower than 63.2, but it's not telling you anything. There's no big picture, there's no analysis, and no real policy lessons that come out from, but they don't see the wood from the trees. So there's partly a quality issue, but it's also a demand side issue because no one actually wants to know what the findings of the evaluation are. They want to commission the evaluations. We have to commission the evaluation, so we did, and tick the box. So that brings me to current practice. So India, in NITI Aayog, merged the ill-fated Independent Evaluation Office with PMU to make the new Development Monitoring Evaluation Office. What do? One of their main things is having this output to outcome framework. So if you're familiar, I have a paper called The 4 Waves, which says you start, first wave is new public management, which is about results and results frameworks and so on. Then you had rise of impact evaluation, particularly RCTs, then a focus on reviews, and then you had knowledge translation, knowledge brokering as the 4th wave. India's very much in the first wave. So again, someone mentioned we used to have planning in India. Go and look at the output to outcome frameworks. You still have planning in India. The output to outcome frameworks are 1-year plans. There's descriptive activities. We're going to build this many buildings, train this many people, spend this much money on this. There's nothing about proper impact there. No serious attempt to think about using evidence. I mean, these are useful things to do. You say you're going to build these buildings, well, good, let's check you build them. But still, to what purpose are you building them? What do you hope to achieve in terms of improving people's lives through building those buildings? That's what you need to be assessing. And even though there are evaluations of the state, the flagship programs, they're not the sort of high quality program evaluations we expect to see. And they're put out for consideration. there's no feedback mechanisms being built into the process to ensure uptake of findings, discussion of these reports in the press, discussion of the reports in Parliament, the sort of things you'd expect to see. So there are exceptions. So in my 4 ways of conceptualization, the important thing is institutionalizing use of evidence. And that's done to some extent. So health, which is an exception globally, has ways in which it incorporates WHO guidelines into our national guidelines, so evidence-based recommendations in various policy areas, but health is the exception, and that's partly because of failings in the international evidence architecture, where these other things similar to WHO don't exist, but it's also failings nationally to basically not understand why, basically the need for evidence. So I think on the supply and demand side, work is needed on both sides to improve the quality of the supply of evidence, to employ relevant evidence, and who was speaking last? Rina was speaking about the importance of practice and not just policy. So I have 5 Ps. It's policy, programs, project, or scores, and practice. All of those things, decision makers for all of those are different. So those decision makers need to be educated. I call them use of evidence workshops, doing things with decision makers to help them guide through what evidence is appropriate to the things they want to know and how to use that evidence, but also working with research agencies to make the connections to get research that's being done, which is usable and used by decision makers. So I think India's got a lot of the infrastructure there, but it's not being used in the right way. And hopefully that will lead is good for global organizations like GDN and Campbell, which would like to be able to engage to support these decision-making processes using evidence. That gives us plenty of opportunity to do so. So I'm very happy to be speaking to this event organized by CSA, and hopefully we'll have a fruitful couple of days.
Thank you very much, Howard. We now have a few questions from the participants, and that's very nice. Thank you. Please continue sharing your comments and questions. Let me start by focusing on something which came in all your comments, which is the potential tension, at least the link between the production of evidence and the interpretation of evidence. So we have a question on whether and how evidence is informed by the social context. Maybe we can actually read this question about the interpretation of evidence, which is indeed certainly informed by the social context. But there are also other dimensions. Howard mentions the role of media. Should we rely on the media as sound interpreters of evidence? And we all know that reading a scientific article and transforming it into a media piece is something that is quite difficult, and journalists may not be the best interpreters of scientific evidence. So how do we deal with this potential tension? The other questions that is relevant to that is how we sift existing evidence, and indeed the question relates to the role of systematic reviews, but not only. And we all know that in the political debate, politicians of all boards will pick the piece of evidence that serves their interests. So we have this series of questions about this distanciation between production and interpretation. So I don't know whether anyone on the panel wants to react on this. And by the way, the chat is not moderated, and we have someone.
Yeah, I'm just removing them. So
Yes. Thank you. No one on interpretation versus production.
I can, respond to that, Pierre, if you will. I think the question here is, interpretation of evidence. Also, it's about like you said, I think Harvard mentioned, it's about whether what is it that, and you said, politicians will be happy to look at regressions if that's the question that they're looking for. The question here is, what is the evidence that you're looking for that suits you at this point in time? And if that is something that is the politics that comes into play when you look at the political process, right? And politics, I mean, it's not as though, if only, and I'm not a politician, but if only policy making was decision science, was an exercise in this, decision making, and it was scientific, then it would be very different. But we do know that policy process is a struggle. It's a struggle between different, conflicting ideas, the conflicting values, conflicting interest groups. And that is why I think the interpretation of evidence is never so straightforward.
Thank you, Renu. I think it's a very important one, because we tend to think of evidence as a sort of homogeneous scientific product. But in fact, once science has spoken, the implication of the scientific findings for action are open to debate and interpretation. And that is something that we sometimes neglect in our approaches to the use of evidence. And that's one reason for which I tend to push for the idea of debating evidence and linking the production and use of evidence with democratic debate, instead of having this linear vision of politicians applying the evidence because evidence guides action. But if we do that, then we get to a multiple world in terms of using evidence, and it becomes difficult to measure the use of evidence. Which again is another question, because we would like to know whether that evidence that was produced was useful and was used. Anyone on this before we move to
Pierre?
Yes.
Yeah, from here. I mean, yes, I think we need a democratic debate of the evidence, but then you start wondering if that's even possible. I mean, if you look at the way media works in India, I mean, it's, again, they are not neutral. Again, they have their own interests and affiliations and so on. And everybody is pushing for the kind of, to promote their own views and preferences. And that really doesn't help. So so where do we start, and where do we stop is the question. And how can we ensure such debates, which are actually helpful, can inform policy? I don't know if any of us have those answers. These are not easy questions, but hey, yeah, how do we do this?
I think we need to stay hopeful and to believe that our prior beliefs over time are informed by scientific evidence, so they can change. So it's a messy process, but again, this is about politics, and if we want to restore the power of science in the debate, we need to accept that, because a kind of simplistic view that we have had over the years about science has been actually detrimental to the credibility of science itself. So I think, I put that on the table. I think there is no alternative to this messy state of things. Anyone?
If I can just come in here, I think I absolutely agree with you. I think this is messy. I think having an ostrich view of hiding behind the kind of more of a technocratic approach to this, and then thinking that this is there are a kind of a bastion of high quality evidence kind of group through which we can move agenda and things forward, I think is just I think it's impractical. That's not how things basically work, because it sort of works in two contexts. It works either in a context where you have absolutely failed state, so you basically can influence a technocratic minister or a secretary you can call up the, pick up the phone, and basically there's no other, kind of competing processes. You are the kind of big, kind of highest rigor, kind of researcher. You can either do that, or you live in a country where you have the perfect institutions, and then your media works and everything works, and you basically can sort of try and influence them. The reality is the world is in between those two. That's our real world, in most countries. So I think there's no other alternative but to sort of really grapple with this messiness. But I think the funders, the donors have not really done a good job in terms of the evidence to policy funding. I think they have taken an annualized, projectized approach to this, a very tick box oriented approach to this, and I think and drawing from the very simplistic equation of either living in a failed kind of a state where your power is measured by whether the secretary knows you, or whether you can influence a true perfect institution. I think both are just fool's paradise.
Thank you very much. Who wants to come in? We have a few minutes left. Yeah, Mike.
Pierre, I was just going to add that I think a lot of it resonates, and I think actually, if I could go slightly off-piste here, one of the things, just reflecting on the history that I've been through, I'm actually a social cultural psychologist by background, and what I see a lot in the work that we do and the way that we approach a lot of that evidence to policy, or at least getting evidence on the table, is actually a lot of it is about communication and sort of interpersonal communication and behavior change. I think it's about the systems, it's about the institutions, it's about things like trust. If you have the trust, I think there's a lot more that you can push for. But I also think it's about knowing the knowledge system of the person, the audience, the people that you are trying to at that point bring the evidence to. And that is actually informed by social cultural norms, right? That's exactly that piece, right? The evidence doesn't exist in isolation, it is contextualized. And I think as researchers, understanding that, so totally agree, it's not unidirectional. Also, science and evidence is not free, it's not bias free, it exists in a context. And I think understanding that complexity, which I don't think we do enough. We sort of assume here's the evidence, and then hopefully someone will either translate it or someone will know that this is sort of what we need to do. I think it's actually working backwards and saying, well, who is it that I'm trying to bring this evidence to? And exactly, I think what Ranjita said, what questions do they want to answer? Perhaps they don't really care about gender at all. So how am I going to bring in that gender lens without actually making it about gender in big, sort of neon signs, right? And how does that fit in there? And I think it also takes time. That's the other thing. I think it's super complex. And for us to assume it is really simplistic, I don't think. So, I mean, my pitch would be, I've always said that we need more social psychologists in the international development world. And I really see it in my job that there's a lot about, well, how do people have different ways of knowing, and how do we sort of position evidence in that? And I think it's the crisis that we see politically too, all over the world. So that's my last sort of reflection on perhaps some of the ways that we can think about this.
Well, thank you very much. I'm afraid we are reaching the end of this session. We still have just 1 minute, so I think it's probably time to conclude. Unfortunately, because I think all these questions would deserve a much longer discussion, and hopefully many of these points will be taken again in the rest of these 2 days. Let me just mention that a lot of it resonates, and with a recent project that we had at GDN with the EIB, in which we tried to do what Mike suggested, which is to combine rapid, relevant, and robust in the production of evidence. And that resonates with this debate because in a way, from the start, we have to frame the research questions in partnership with the users. And it's not an easy thing, because most of the time, there will be a tendency from the researcher side to say, well, the questions that you ask are not researchable. But of course, we cannot stay there. We need to find how research can still help even in situations in which good academic research will be very difficult to conduct, not only because lack of data, but also because the methodology will be hard to find out and so on. So my point is that increasingly researchers should become both more modest and more flexible. And instead of defining their own research questions and defining themselves what would be relevant, they would actually ask the users, the potential users, about the kind of things that they would like to see evidence on. And that changes, it makes life a little bit more complicated for the researchers, but it's much more interesting and rewarding in the end. So we talked a lot about the politics of evidence production. Actually, much of what was said was also about the politics of evidence use. And we agreed, I think, that we need to study that a little bit more deeply, which actually leads me to the conclusion that we need more than economists to do that, because economists may not be the best specialists about political processes. So it is time to open the science of producing evidence to much more than economists and include all kinds of scientific, hard and social science as well. And this is something that is also challenging. So thank you very much for a very rich and too short debate. I apologize for managing it in a way that makes it very short, but it was still fascinating. Thanks you. And Ashrita, the floor is back to you. Thank you. And thanks to all the panelists.
Thank you.
Hey, thank you so much, speakers and Professor Peer, for an enlightening and engaging session. There's a lot of food for thought here, and I'm sure there are a lot of good questions coming up from the audience as well. And I do hope the keynote speakers and the chair will take some of these questions up during that session. Again, it is my pleasure to introduce the chair for the keynote address today, which is the Evidence is Generated, Curated, and Used in Devising Development Plans and Program. Dr. Sudarshan Suji is the Chief Executive Officer of Save the Children, an alumnus of St. Stephen's College, Delhi University, and Institute of Development Studies. Prior to joining the Save the Children, he was the Secretary General at SOS Children's Village of India. He also brings in the academic experience, having teaching experience at IRMA and IHMR. He also serves on governance platforms, being on board of Udyogini and Academic Council of IHMR Rural Management Program. Dr. Sudarshan, it is a pleasure to have you here, and over to you now.
Thank you. Thanks. And first, a disclaimer that I am far away from being a doctor and very privileged today, not just for this gathering, but particularly to be on a platform where Dr. Lama is going to be sharing and building the perspective. And Dr. Lama may not recall, but we go back a long way, some 25 years back, National Dairy Development Board. So yeah, so it's a pleasure to see him again today here. And my own journey vis-a-vis the evidence began some 30 years ago, studying analysis and planning of development projects. And I think in Oslo University at Norway, but what questions challenged me then continue to fox me till today. And I'm hoping that even as we demystify and unravel the context, I'm hoping, Dr. Lama, that even as you build our context for this today, I'm also in terms of, how is it generated, curated, and, how do we develop the the plan? I just want to pose to the audience and Dr. Lama particularly to you that whose reality eventually counts, and how do we make it count if that's the reality? Excel sheets and all other programs have a way of blurring the ground reality context and looking at the world from the person who's the primary stakeholder in the journey. And at times, I think if we can use evidences to go back to, I mean, I am prejudiced for small is beautiful context. So plurality of small rather than, looking at big is the only way. But without much ado, Dr. Lama, let me pass on the baton to you. But before that, let me also introduce you very briefly to the audience as, an amazing journey. One of our youngest first vice chancellors of a university, and then a youngest professor, and the list goes on. But that is something for people to read on the social media. What also distinguishes you is, again, you come as a person who has the grassroots perspective, who has seen the world from the lenses of a marginal farming community context, or marginal communities and the rural communities. So I think that lens, I have followed you since then, continues to bring that reality check, or it's obvious in the reflectivity that you have brought in, and that, I think, introduction is as much, if not more, significant than all the rest of your formal accomplishments. Dr. Lama, over to you for the next 15 minutes, and we'll follow up the questions on the chat. And thank you, Dr. Lama. You're on mute, Dr. Lama.
Thank you very much. Namaste to all of you, and Dr. Sudarshan Suchi. What a pleasure to see you after such a long time, right? And well, I'm going to give you some historical and current examples of why we need to develop consciously, collectively, and socially evidences to convince the policymakers that these are these are the realities people would like to have, communities would like to have. And this is very important, particularly when you see the reforms process have deepened, the planning, monitoring, and evaluation process has weakened, I must tell you, right? We have withdrawn the entire planning process in the country, like India, before it reached some of the communities, some of the geographies, right? So that was, and that has led to a kind of a new varieties of complexities and complications. Let me go back to how evidences really help, right? We have this very protracted debate in India about illegal migrants, economic migrants, infiltrators, all kinds. Well, depending upon, when you don't have a migration policy, you call the same set of migrants as illegal or infiltrator or economic migrants or all kinds of things, because you don't have a migration policy. And whenever we discuss migrants from anywhere outside, anywhere in our neighboring countries, we think that we only talk about the pull factors, right? And the pull factors and how these migrants bring some kind of inflections, conflicts, all kinds of things, right? Instabilities and all. But we really do not look into the push factors. And in case of migrants like that from Bangladesh, right? You find push factors to be very, very eminent. And over the years, when evidences were brought about as to why migrations is taking place from Bangladesh, then people would understand, policymakers would do this kind of negotiations, that kind of policy, what you call it, interventions. So jute productions, among the pull factors, jute and jute products used to be one of the most critical export items of Bangladesh. right? And it used to be a major constituents in the entire agricultural development process there. Suddenly in 80s, you find that the global world would develop some kind of synthetic fibers, and at one go, the entire jute industry will be wiped out. And millions of farmers will move to the cities. And in some cases, they will be absorbed in garment factories in Dhaka or in some other cities. In some cases, they will find their ways into much more fertile and much more what you call attractive lands. So till these studies were done, many people thought that it is a kind of a political game. It is a kind of a strategic, what you call it, geopolitical strategic interventions by some other third force. Similarly, when studies started coming about the environmental issues, particularly the diversions of Farakka, at Farakka, the Ganges River, you have the white paper on the Ganges water dispute by Bangladesh government. India government produced the Farakka barrage, and such kind of studies did very intensive studies on irrigation, depletions, increased salinations, right? And all that. But till independent scholars like Ashok Swine, right, did this study from Uppsala University. Many people did not think that that was the right, what you call it, studies, that some kind of bias studies were done by these two countries. So Ashok Swine did a very comprehensive study, and many of us who were debating at that particular time in 80s and 90s did come out with how this migration is related to, particularly from Khulna, where the growth rate of population was one of the lowest among the divisions there. Why migrations took place, and in what explains the lowest growth rate of populations. And so it was a very interesting situation. So that led to a kind of a major warming up relations between India and Bangladesh. Let me go to Bhutan. You know, Bhutan, when for the first time Bhutanese adopted a democratic constitutions, and the elections were held in 2008 onwards, right? One of the top Bhutanese bureaucrats, they call it Dasos, and who became Limpo, that is minister also, and he became prime minister after winning the elections. And in one of my meetings, he said, "Professor, I'll tell you a very interesting thing." I said, "What is that?" He said, "You know, UN data says that data very clearly show that Bhutanese, 80%, 85% of the Bhutanese have access to drinking water." And when he was campaigning as from one of the political parties, he had to compulsorily go to all the districts and large number of villages. And he suddenly realized that there are no drinking water in majority of the villages, right? And he himself was the representative of Bhutan in the UN, and he was always talking about 80%, 85%. So he had a dilemma. Came back and spoke to his wife, what is to be done? Do we accept 85% or the reality, right? This is what you call is the policy makers themselves, when they are exposed to realistic situation at the grassroots, I think that makes a huge difference. Similarly, in case of Bhutan, again, I'll give you an example of hydropower projects. Many people across people across policy spectrum in South Asia was quite skeptical about what would happen to Bhutan, right? But today, evidences have come that how Bhutan has become a kind of has an installed capacity of 2,300 plus megawatt, right? And how it earns almost 16.23 billion rupees per annum, and how it contributes about 1/3 of government revenues. and 9% of country's GDP, and 38% of total export basket. So these are the evidences. But more than this, there are studies now with that show that the first hydropower project in Tala, around that 61% of the households in the surveyed districts have access to mobile phones. 95% in the villages in Chuka had access to improved sanitations and all kinds of evidences. ADB gave another evidences that Bhutan alone would be the carbon dioxide reductions due to hydropower generations transferred from Bhutan alone would be about 10 million tons in 2016-17, and as high as 40 million tons annually in 2021. So evidences, right? And this has strengthened the Bhutanese political decision makers, policy makers, to really do some more projects in different geographies of Bhutan, and that's what they have started doing this. Pakistan, look at Pakistan. You know, the famous Pakistani economist, the author of Human Development Report, Mahbub al-Haq, when he was the finance minister, he writes in his Human Development in South Asia report in 1997, he writes about how transmission system actually failed, right? How delivery mechanisms actually failed in Pakistan during his own finance ministership. I quote him, he says, "My own rude awakening came quite early after a decade's experience with Pakistan development planning. After generating a GNP growth rate of 7% per annum during 1960s, our team of young and enthusiastic economic planners was getting ready to bow on the national stage in 1968. It greatly puzzled us that the majority of the people were not as impressed with the quantum of growth as we were, and instead were asking for an instant demise of the government. What had really happened was that while national income had increased, human lives had shriveled as the benefits of growth had been hijacked by powerful pressure groups." This is a very interesting example of what a finance minister himself says. Then there are huge gaps. You know, in the last session, there were discussed policy for what, who makes the policy, right? Who are the constituents in the policy making? How do you really fit them? I have this personal experience in dealing with this. In Sikkim, when I was last time chief economic advisor in the beginning of 2000 onwards, I did a human development report for Sikkim. Sikkim was this third state in the country to do this report. And while doing that, we found that the food production in Sikkim is highly overestimated, right? If you add total food production there, and if you add PDAs, import from outside Sikkim, then private merchants, distribution of food, you will find per capita availability or even consumption of food in Sikkim would be almost more than 1,100 grams, right? Whereas all India average would be hardly 400 to 500 grams. That means a Sikkimese, when he gets up in the morning, he will eat rice. During the day, he will eat rice. At 4 o'clock for snacks. It's untenable. So when we said this, there was a big debate in the cabinet about what is this all about. Then the second more interesting issue was there was a huge subsidy, untargeted subsidy, rampant subsidy given to all kinds of people in Sikkim. As a result of which food production, people were not, traditionally they are farmers. So even these farmers were quite reluctant. Why should I produce a kilogram of paddy at the rate of 25, whereas I can get the same rice at the rate of 4 rupees in the market? So we brought this, how it has started affecting the Sikkimese economy. So in the first half of my presentation, when I said this, and there was a break, the political leaders, including the top man, came and told me, look, what you have said is absolutely correct. and these bureaucrats do not believe in this. Then after about in the second half, during the lunch, when we had when we had adequate discussion, the set of bureaucrats will come and tell me, look, professor, what you did is something which we cannot tell these political leaders. You have said the right thing. So there was a huge gap among the bureaucrats on the political leadership on the issue of very, very serious and sensitive policy making. Therefore, I would suggest always that there must be in the policy making a constant, a very, very intrinsic element in the of third force, consisting of professionals, consisting of academics, consisting of civil society members and NGOs. Now, what I also would like to mention about is how hegemonic discourse can lead to some kind of dislocations in the entire policy making. For example, Chinese participation in Sri Lanka, right, in Hambantota port, in the Colombo port, in a number of other development projects, we generally get a kind of a hegemonic discourse is they look that Chinese would really put the entire Sri Lankan economy into make it a highly debt-ridden economy and grab all the economic opportunities. And when it reaches a particular threshold, it could even start fiddling with its sovereignty, identity, and all. Till a study came out by two top Sri Lankan economists, our own friends, Dusini Virakun and Jayasuriya in 2019. And they said, look, only 10% of the foreign debt in 2019 was Chinese. And they also said, and in this 10% or so, 60% was lent on concessional and 40% in non-concessionary terms. Look, the entire hegemonic discourse, right? A kind of a biased discourse triggered by some set of institutions absolutely finished this, right? So therefore, it is very, very important. Say, I would feel in some cases, policy would, what you call it, policy would discipline the policymakers.
We have 3 more minutes, Dr. Lama. Thanks.
The actors. Therefore, I would say that, look, in some cases, not to have a policy itself is a policy, right? Precisely because in the absence of policy, you can do you'll have maneuverability. In a number of cases, we have put evidences. Say, for example, all the chief ministers of the Himalayan states in India met at Mussoorie in 2019, along with the finance minister, Niti Aayog vice chairman, and the 15th Finance Commission. I happen to be representing Sikkim, and we discussed about how these Himalayan states are badly affected in terms of what you call it, the geographical area disadvantage index and infrastructure deficit index. And we made a plea that we do strong kind of protections to the entire geography of India through our eco services. We have number of development opportunities we'll have to forego because of these and that. And these eco services have never been evaluated, nor they have never been given values, as a result of which we are a constant losers. And when we said this, there was kind of studies done in Forest Research Institute. There were studies done in G.V. Pant Institute, some of our own institutes, and it started when the evidence is coming up, right? And in some of the cases, the Finance Commission, the Finance Minister, Niti Aayog, started, yes, this has to be really made into a policy debate. But my last point at this stage is, the esoteric debate about the recovery after the the COVID-19 would be L-shaped or U-shaped or V-shaped and all. But we wanted to go out of that, and we wanted to provide concrete evidences of where we have lost in a small economy like Sikkim. So we did a very, very comprehensive study. Say, for example, tourism, the entire tourism industry was literally stopped by the lockdown, the process of lockdown. A farmer was affected, a taxi driver was affected, a travel agent, electrician, and all this. So we wanted to do some kind of a micro-analysis of that. That's how we did this first report in Economic Revival Committee Report 2020. And these evidences are now used widely. Therefore, I would say that micro-level interventions are evidences through micro-level interventions, as rightly pointed out in the Poverty Commission report of South Asia in 1992, like Jan Savaya program in Sri Lanka, Pani Panchayats in India, Monga District Health Project in Bhutan, right? And what you call it, Small Farmers Development Program in Nepal, Grameen Bank Yojana, BRAC in Bangladesh, Aga Khan Rural Support Programs. All those are very, very important in order to generate a much more convincing, much more community-based, and much more local resources-based evidences, and they have been widely acclaimed by the policymakers across in South Asia. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Dr. Lama, for that wonderful journey in a snapshot, brief time. Quite a challenge, and I think you delivered it. If people have questions, please post them on the chat group or just raise your hand. Dr. Lama, just to provoke you, why is there so much skepticism surrounding evidences in our country? I mean, particularly vis-a-vis the government, the state. I mean,
well, because we have moved away from institutions, right? Institutions like Planning Commission, institutions in each and every governmental body in the state level, like Planning and Development, in some cases, Planning, Development and Evaluations Body. We have increasingly moved out of these institutions, and we have made decision-making process much more, to a large extent, on a political plane or individualized plane. So the role of institutions have been drastically cut down. It is not only in India. I can see that happening in Nepal. I can see that happening to a large extent even in a country like Pakistan and Sri Lanka, and of course in a small country like Maldives also, right? Therefore, the more we move away from institutions, because it is the institutions that actually internalize these reports, feed the policymakers in a kind of a proper way, because the stock of knowledge, highly technical knowledge, highly technical database has to be translated and transmitted in a very, very simple language to the policymakers, particularly when policymakers are not highly educated people. Policymakers are not exposed to kind of understanding, and they are understanding a kind of in a crisscrossed manner, interdisciplinary manner. Therefore, I would say the more we move away from institutional approach to absorbing these kind of evidences, the more we would suffer.
Thank you. Thanks. Dr. Lama, parallelly, there's a particular question which I'm going to read out, although it's not in order of precedence. How much and in what way evidence is informed by social context, the culture and values preferred by communities, especially in countries like India? Is there any sensitivity analysis exercises that you are aware of?
Yeah, it goes. It goes. So, for example, as a university professor, when I get a thesis, when I get a PhD thesis, I do like to communicate some of the findings of this thesis. So last thesis I got was from Terry, Advanced Studies, and a doctoral student had done a very extensive, beautiful studies on the cardamom production, the entire value chain, supply chain, all kinds of things about cardamom in Sikkim. And that had a huge parallel in Nepal, in Myanmar and Bhutan, right? So I found the study very, very useful. And they were all community-based studies, going back to what has been both the traditional and non-traditional pattern and all. And when I translated these studies into a very small write-up saying that, look, this is how, these are the newer varieties of technologies available. And I find the community is very keen to understand. But what I could do was translate it into a local language, Nepali, right? Which was widely read in Nepal, which was widely read in Bhutan and in India. Therefore, I would say, how do you simplify your evidences? And how do you make it a public good, right? Where the communities would start owning it up, communities would start pressurizing the respective political constituents and the bureaucratic constituents, say that, look, we want this. This is what is available to us, but we did not know this was also available in other parts. So why not? And that really helps. That really helps and really integrates the entire policy making, process.
I have this interesting question from Madhurida. Do researchers need to undertake or join political action to restore the now eroded research function of the government institutions?
Well, for me, last 35 years, I have seen the height of some of the governmental institutions also. And I have also seen the sharp decline in governmental institutions across South Asia, right? One reason, of course, is that generation which were absolutely committed, which could relate culture, society, polity, geography, geopolitics to development process. That entire generation is now gradually fading away. And the new generation, the stock of knowledge as far as inheritance is concerned, the new generations has its own priorities, has its own instrumentalities, right? And has its own, alliance with the political parties and the policy. Therefore, I would say more and more researchers, right, from universities, from think tanks, should not hesitate to go and work with the government, join government, strengthen the governmental processes, right? And also give some kind of alternative thinking as far as development dynamics are concerned, other than what the usual orthodox variety of bureaucrats do.
Thank you. Dr. Lama, one last question. I mean, there are, of course, many pouring in the chat box, but how do we as a nation, as a, the state, the non-state, the civil service organization and other, how do we handle failure as evidence? I mean, where are we on that?
See, the failure has a political cost, right? And whenever failure has a political cost, most of the evidences will be swept under the carpet. I've seen that, right? Because it has a political cost, people have to win the elections, all kinds of things. Therefore, in such a situation, the role of media becomes very, very critical, right? I would like to communicate to the media as far as this concern, but media has to be cultivated. It cannot be a one-time effort. Media has to be cultivated, nurtured, trained as far as reporting critical development issues are concerned. And I find particularly in the mainstream media, right? Except some very exceptionally brilliant journalists, even mainstream media has started, picking up that would suit the political constituents. Therefore,
Yeah.
this kind of media, not only at the national level, say for example, I always feel, come from a village, right, in Darjeeling, he started teaching in JNU, did this kind of development activities, that kind of, I always feel, why should everything be concentrated in a place like Delhi? Delhi is not India, and India is not Delhi. I always say this, right? There are several places. So go. That's why we are now saying, as far as Northeast is concerned, we should have reverse integration. Rest of India should integrate with Northeast, not Northeast with the rest of India, right? So we are, such kind of thinking would bring warmth, would bring vibrancy, would bring some kind of curiosity, and would bring new kind of dedications among the younger researchers. And that is happening. I can see, at least in some of the research institutes located in distant, far off, a kind of a periphery.
Thank you. I think, I mean, nothing better to actually spell out than the fact that Delhi is not India, as you emphatically mentioned. There is so much evidence of so much context and opportunities in the what looks like peripheries now, but if they could be mainstreamed and Delhi becomes the periphery, I think no better testimonial to evidence-based planning.
Absolutely,
So
absolutely.
thank you, Dr. Lama, and thanks rest of you. My apologies, we couldn't take rest of your questions because I am standing between you and the line. And I think that about sums it up, that failures are something I think we need to take this on the stride and look at the opportunities that they present. And in addition, I think turn the entire process of planning and the evidence around from a Delhi centric or top heavy context to that which is stretched out across the length and breadth of where things are happening and meant to be happen. And as I said in the beginning, whose reality counts actually.
Absolutely.
And that's it. So thank you. Thanks, Dr. Lama. And thank you everybody else for joining this session.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you, Dr. Sudarshan. What a pleasure meeting again. We must meet.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Saran, Asrita Saran,
Yeah.
too. Thank you very much.
So much, Dr. Lama. It was really an insightful talk. And thank you so much, Dr. Sudarshan, for chairing the session. It was really wonderful.
Thank you.
And thank you, everyone. So we will now break for 15 minutes and you can move on to the virtual coffee break. Yashika here can help you with that. She can, I think, move you all together. And after 15 minutes, we will come back and we will be listening to a very interesting and engaging panel put together by J-PAL South Asia Regional Center. So we will be taking break for 15 minutes now and we will join back in the same room.
Hi, Yashika.
Hello,
When are we starting the next session?
it's 2:05.
Okay, thanks.
Welcome.
Welcome back, everyone. I do hope you had a time to grab a cup of coffee and get your hands on something to munch on in between the sessions. And just want to highlight, if you would like to share your work with your colleagues, and if you have important links to share, feel free to share the link to your coworkers on Twitter. We have an event hashtag, so feel free to share your work when you're in the Palo sessions, or that will help, help you in coordinating and networking between your colleagues. I would now like to move on to our next interesting panel put together by Jaypal, and I would like to introduce the chair for the session. Sharanya Chandran is the Associate Director of Policy at Jaypal South Asia. She leads the strategic planning and management of policy vertical at Jaypal South Asia and provides strategic oversight to the different sector teams. She also oversees Jaypal South Asia's partnership with different state governments aimed at institutionalizing an evidence-informed approach to policy making by forging research, capacity building, and policy collaborations. Prior to joining Jaypal, Sharanya worked as a principal consultant for the National Skill Development Agency, Government of India, where she worked with multiple stakeholders on addressing policy and implementation gaps in the skill development. Sharanya, it's a pleasure to have you and your team here with us, and over to you now.
Thank you so much, Ashrita. Thanks for inviting us to curate this panel. We are very excited, and thanks everyone to for joining this discussion today. Jaypal South Asia is really excited to host this panel at the Evidence for Development South Asian Region Conference, organized by Campbell and Global Development Network. And we're really excited to contribute to our collective and shared understanding of how evidence can support policies and transformation in the South Asian region. The motivation for us really stemmed from the fact that there's a growing body of rigorous research that aims to understand the impact of anti-poverty programs for improving the lives of the poor and vulnerable populations in a most cost-effective way. And yet one finds that it often takes a long time to translate this evidence into action and actually improve lives, lives of people at scale. And in many cases, critical evidence may never fall onto the right ears or at the right time, or both. And so it's really necessary for development stakeholders, to take stock of their efforts to inform policy and identify these pathways for translating research into action in a timely manner. So that was really the motivation. And this is really an area where Jaypal has been working right since its inception, almost 2 decades ago. And our understanding of this often non-linear path of translating research into action has been evolving as we have gone along this journey. One of our primary learnings, of course, has been that the need and power of forging partnerships at all levels between implementers, between researchers, research organizations, donors for enabling this. And so, of course, there have been many successes along the way. For instance, several studies of programs developed by our partners around the region on remedial education have shared powerful insights on which approaches work and equally which don't. For instance, our 15-plus-year-long collaboration between Jaypal researchers and NGO Pratham led to this iterative process of innovation and evaluation to develop an approach for reorienting instruction and targeting it to the level of each child rather than age or grade. And this helped them acquire basic language and math skills at the primary level. And learnings from this approach, the teaching at the right level approach, have subsequently been scaled up and improved the lives of 60 million students in India and Africa. Similarly, we have insights from research on how technology-aided tools could help deliver personalized instructions to secondary school students to enable similar catch-up. And we'll hear more about this at today's panel, as we have representatives from both the implementation side, educational initiatives who developed this model, but equally from the Jaypal affiliate side, who tested the same. And so these are just a few examples of successes, but we all know, how challenging this process can really be of evidence to policy action, enabling this. And it's often not automatic. It requires considerable time, thinking, and efforts on everyone's side. And so a key question then becomes, how can we really develop and align incentives of researchers, policymakers, donors to navigate and ease these pathways of using evidence to inform policy decisions? And this is really the motivation of today's discussion. So thank you so much for joining this discussion. And we have an excellent panel today and representing these diverse set of stakeholders along the research to action funnel. And I'm going to now introduce them. Mr. Tejveer Singh. Mr. Singh is an IAS officer of the 1994 batch belonging to the Punjab cadre. He did a BA Honours and a Master's in History from St. Stephen's College, New Delhi. He holds an MSc degree in Public Management and Governance with distinction from the London School of Economics and Political Science. He's currently serving as Principal Secretary to the Chief Minister of Punjab and Principal Secretary Civil Aviation, Government of Punjab. Mr. Tejveer has worked in the Government of India as faculty member of the Lal Bahadur Shastri National Academy of Administration, Labasna, Mussoorie, where he served as Deputy Director, Senior and Joint Director. He has also engaged closely with various research organizations like JPAL in an attempt to institutionalize evidence-based decision-making in Punjab. It's an honor to have you here today, Mr. Tejveer. Mr. Pranav Kothari. He's the CEO of Educational Initiatives. He has been closely associated with EI for over a decade and has made significant contributions through his involvement with EI's adaptive learning product, MindSpark, and as head of HR, Gifted Student Education, and most recently, EI's large-scale education program division. Pranav has led multiple teams that scaled high-quality student assessments, personalized adaptive learning, impact services for governments, CSR funders, as well as philanthropic organizations. He's a TEDx speaker and has been named by the World Economic Forum's Schwab Foundation as a corporate social intrapreneur of the year in 2019. He studied mechanical engineering in Georgia Institute of Technology, and he's an MBA from Harvard Business School. Dr. Abhijit Singh, Associate Professor, Stockholm School of Economics. Abhijit Singh is an Associate Professor at the Stockholm School of Economics, and he studies topics including the economics of education, child nutrition, public service delivery in developing countries. He is a JPAL affiliated professor and also part of the CCFO Economics of Education Research Network in Munich, the Center for Global Development, and the Young Life Study. He received a master's and a doctorate in economics from University of Oxford. Sukhmani Sethi is the Asia Regional Director at Porticus. She was previously a program manager at Porticus and developed the organization's educational programs fostering whole child development in India. Prior to Porticus, she worked with Mathematica, policy research, and innovations for poverty action, conducting impact evaluations of large-scale government NGO projects, and she's also worked as a research associate with Pratham Asar Center. Sukhmani has a bachelor's in history from LSR, New Delhi, and a master's in international development from Brandeis University. Niriksha Shetty is the country director for precision agriculture, Precision X development in India. She leads strategy and implementation of PXD's two-way customized agricultural advisory support, programs that leverage technology, data science, and behavioral economics to serve over 1 million farmers across 6 states in India. She is an international development professional with many years of experience in designing and implementing evidence-based interventions in the agriculture sector. She holds a master's in public administration and international development from Harvard Kennedy School and a bachelor's in economics and mathematics from Franklin and Marshall College. Welcome, everyone. From the bios, you would have realized what an esteemed panel we have, and it's really been an honor to have you with us today. So a quick word on the format before we jump into the individual opening remarks of our speakers. In this first section of the panel, post the opening remarks, which will be 6 minutes each of all the panelists. This will be followed by a moderated Q&A, and then that will be followed by an audience question and answer session. And please, to the audience with us here, feel free to write your questions in along with the speakers you'd like to address this to on the chat box. So without further delay, I'm going to start off by inviting Abhijit. Abhijit, your research has been on diverse themes, including child nutrition, public service delivery, and of course, on leveraging technology to improve educational outcomes. You've worked on such a range of topics and stakeholders. Can you talk a little bit about your experience in engaging with this evidence to action journey of working with governments as well as NGOs? What has this really looked like for you?
So first of all, thanks a lot for having me here. I think the important part, at least from a research point of view, is first of all the recognition that essentially good programs are designed. good programs are designed by people, who've actually been working on the ground, typically for several years, and that really requires strong partnerships in order for any of that research to eventually translate into practice. And that's true both for the private and the government sectors, right? So there are champions of specific types of interventions or reforms, both in the private setting and government. And one example of that, of course, is say the kind of work that we've been doing with EI over, well, now the past 6 years or so. So starting from like about 2014, 2015, and a lot of the work that I think happens with partners who are in the NGO or the private sector is typically in the nature of efficacy trials, right? So lots of people have lots of interventions. And then what you want to work on is, well, to first figure out, does it work even at modest scales? Because if it does not work at like reasonably modest scales, if the theory of change does not make sense, then trying to evaluate any scaled up version of it is going to be premature, right? So from a research point of view, I think one of the things that I and various co-authors, including say Professor Karthik Muralidharan, have been focused on is to only start evaluating things in proof of concept trials after the intervention itself is stable, right? So what you go out looking for is organizations who are deep sectoral experts. So our expertise is largely in sort of evaluating things, in trying to link it to other things that are happening in the sector, to other things that might be happening in development policy. So EI, for instance, was a very good partner to start with because they'd already been working in the area for, I think, well over a decade. And even specifically on the product that we were evaluating, which is MindSpark, had already been in place for several years, had lakhs of students use it. So we knew that the product itself was stable. Okay, so that's one. So that's one set of study, one type of study, which is that you try something small, and then if it works, you try and make it work bigger. So we've been working with the government of Rajasthan. So we had an initial study in Delhi, which was in out-of-school centers, and where we found really remarkable effects that also seemed to connect with a larger research base that we'd had around remedial instruction, about learning gaps in Indian schools and the like. And then now we're working with the government of Rajasthan, and there's been 3 years of intervention before the Corona crisis shut down schools. And that was to do it at 20 times the scale. And you can make many things work in Delhi, but they might not work when you start working in rural Rajasthan, right? So then we moved to Churu, Jhunjhunu, Udaipur, Dungarpur, both urban and rural areas, to see if you can make this work with government teachers in government schools in the regular timetable. And that's a completely different version of trying to do this. There's a second kind of trial, and that's been what partnerships with government frequently look like, which is that maybe there isn't evidence at a small scale, but governments are going to do interventions, and they're not going to wait 5 years for the evidence base to necessarily build up. And if governments are going to do something at a large scale, then frequently it is worth trying to engage and see if there is a reasonable evaluation that can be done, right? So I mean, a lot of work that, for instance, Professor Muralidharan and I have been doing with, or were doing with the government of Madhya Pradesh, looked essentially at that, right? So there's a whole bunch of school management reforms that had already been approved, right? So they've been working for a long time with ARC and with various other partners to try and figure out school management reforms. And we helped work at it at a stage when they were already going to do it in 2,000 schools, and then eventually that dovetailed into the National Shala Siddhi mission, which was then being done at 25,000 schools. And that's something which is a different template. And then we're doing, say, similar work on private school quotas in under the RTE, so clause 12(1)(c) of the RTE, reserve seats in private schools. And so we're doing some work with the government of Chhattisgarh. We might be doing some work with the government of Tamil Nadu, and that is a different model, which is to say, this is something big, this is going to happen in the world, and it would be good for us to figure out if it works. And if it doesn't, are there tweaks that we can do to make it work? And if it really doesn't work, then even if this state will continue doing it, maybe the next time a different state has a conversation with us, we can say, that's not the intervention you want to bet on, and maybe there's something else, right? So that's, I think, largely been our general way of operating. And yeah, and then just like the one final bit is that in order for a research collaboration with any implementing organization, be it government or be it NGO, I think what makes it work is A, like, fairly frequent communication, and B, build a shared building of some amount of trust, right? And in particular, to go back to something that was mentioned in the last panel, I think it needs to be clear ex ante, like, so beforehand, that everyone's willing to listen to the evidence, because frequently trials will show zero effects, right? So I think on average, about half of the things that we try end up showing no distinguishable effect on any outcome. And then I think everyone in the system needs to be bought into the idea that we will publish that regardless. And we would disseminate it regardless, because you learn as much from the zeros as you do from stuff that works, especially if the zeros are something that was achieved at scale for a government policy that was going to happen in any case, right? So we've been lucky that we've consistently had a set of partners who were fine with that, but that's not always the case. And and I think from a research point of view, I think that's very important to establish early on. I think that's everything for me.
Thank you so much, Abhijit. I think you have really raised some very crucial points as to, what are the different types of, entry points for researchers as you think of, evaluations within both the NGO private ecosystem, but equally then within the government ecosystem. It could be innovations that you have tested at a small scale, and then you're trying to scale this up and see at scale what happens. Is there a dilution, or whether results hold, and then advocate for scale from that route? Or it could be improving, tweaking existing government programs to improve them, because they're anyway going to take place, and sort of also this question of trust and openness to being to knowing that some things work, some things don't. I think that's a very, very important one, and I think we will revisit that at multiple times within this panel discussion. So thank you. I'm going to now turn it over to Pranav to share the practitioner side of part of the same story that Abhijit narrated. So EI has partnered with the School of Researchers, Professor Muralidharan, Abhijit, and co-researchers in having their MindSpark program evaluated. So how was this journey from a practitioner side, and sort of how are you thinking of leveraging the findings of this research as you think through your programmatic strategy over the coming years? I think you're on mute.
Okay, yeah, hi, sorry. It was not allowing me to unmute, so some host had to unmute me. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for this opportunity, Shania. To build off top of Abhijit, I think the trust element is something I'd like to double click on, because, before we signed up for the JPAL RCT, we had lots of internal conversations on what if this shows a zero, right? And because it would be publicly displayed that MindSpark had no effect if that was the outcome. But internally, we decided that, even that would help us sort of learn more. We have been doing this for some time. We've done some internal experiments to measure the impact on student learning outcomes, but it would be good to be subject to an evaluation that has been done rigorously and as third party. I also want to thank Porticus because they were the people who sponsored the continuing of the operations during the trial, and through another indirect source have been funding JPAL's pre-primary and other evaluations. So I think Porticus has one of the few funders that has willing to pay for impact reports. Everybody wants it, but very few are willing to pay for it. So I think that's the first point. I think the second point is, I was very naive initially, thinking that as long as evidence is there, everything will scale, right? And I was like, why not? Like, what's the reason for good things to not scale? But my first lesson I learned was that economics also matter, right? So we were running the first version of our centers at approximately a price point of $150 per child per year. And at that point, that was equal to what the government was spending on education, or roughly half of that. and quickly realized that that does not make financial sense. Why would the government spend double the amount? It was just the money was not available. So then we decided that we need to lower costs and decided to plug into the government system. So as opposed to having centers that are outside the school after school hours, we pivoted to have everything inside the school premises, using the resources that they are spending on working with the government school teachers. So there's higher buy-in, doing this during school hours so that attendance is higher. And now we were able to do it for about 1/10 the price that the government was spending, right? And so now you can have a better conversation with the government saying, can you repurpose the bottom 10% of your spending towards something that actually doubles your learning outcome? And then I naively thought, okay, now everything is solved. And I walk into the Principal Secretary of Education in Rajasthan's office and I present this to him. And he says, are you mad or what? I'm not going to add 10,000, staff members to my payroll, even if it makes financial sense. That just, is something we're not willing to do. Which taught me a lesson that even if the impact is there, the financial, economically, this makes sense. There is a whole operational side of things. There's a human resource side of things, which, given variety of reasons, governments may not want to take additional staff members on payroll. And so we started emphasizing how can this integrate better with the staff that the government school already has. So we now sort of even looked at peons or people who were generally interested but had a role in the principal's office. Teachers, of course, were at the center of all of this, and came up with a plan that in the first year we would have one person in each school. In the second year, one for 4 schools, and in the third year, one for 8 schools, and eventually in the fourth year, no people. And I think forcing that in a top-down sort of mandate to the team helped come up with ideas on, what would we have to do to make sure the school is still measuring, still utilizing the learning software, but is not dependent on our team. Like in the first year, schools were like, okay, your person is coming, the Mindspark lab in charge is coming, let them run the show. But when we talked about this to principals, we faced a lot of resistance, and eventually sort of explained them that it's not feasible for us to do this, and had a roadmap to that. So those are my lessons learned as I stumbled through the hoops. Eventually, I also think that some of us have a romantic notion of scale of our products, right? Like people keep asking me, so how many millions of students is Mindspark serving? And sometimes I feel like it's the idea that matters more, right? A high quality, adaptive, personalized learning software that is based on pedagogy research, that is contextualized to a child's language and familiar environments, that generates data. That idea needs to scale. It's not that, and Mindspark is one iteration of that idea. There has to be many, many more. And we've seen that how microfinance as an idea has scaled, even if Grameen Bank or the early pioneers of that were the first one to do. So that has become my definition of scale, is to look at the idea, not just the product itself. I want to recount one very important value add that even researchers can add on the operational elements. When we started Mindspark, for 9 years, we had been espousing on the personalized part of it. And we always said that there needs to be a single student interacting with the computer. The ownership can be fractional. Like in Delhi, we had one computer that was used by 12 students, but at a time it was just one student on one computer, because like our Facebook and Gmail accounts, we all log in and it's personalized to that. Now, in the Rajasthan schools, there were only 20 computers and 30 students. So initially we were doing batching. So 20 students would come, 10 students would be in the classroom, or sometimes we had 10 students sitting on the floor. And we realized this is very suboptimal. And Karthik and Abhijit sort of came up with this idea of having 2 students to one computer. And this was like sacrilege to our religion. We're like, how can we have 2 people sitting in front of the Mindspark software? This is not possible. This is against everything we've done for the last 8 years. But I visited schools and I saw it was super painful to see students waiting, and I thought it was super disruptive for the teacher to have half the students in the class, half in the lab. So we took a leap of faith, and we allowed, we came up with this idea of all students together. And thanks to the wizardry that Abhijit has, he was able to measure the impact of 2 students on one computer versus 1 on 1. And then factoring in other factors, we found that we were no worse off. And overall, for a resource constrained country like India, you will always have fewer devices than students. And this was a deep, operational pivot we made by sort of listening to JPAL, although we did resist it for quite some time. So I think one has to be just open-minded about some things, even if they run very deeply counter to what you fundamentally believe in. Yeah, I should probably stop talking so that others get a chance. Yeah.
No, I think these were really, really bang on, Pranav. Thank you so much for sharing and for so openly sharing your thoughts as well. I think there were several things you touched upon, including sort of the economies of scale of working with governments and the importance of looking at the economics of it all, not just the program itself. But equally, sort of this, I think this thought really resonated with me on the idea needs to scale and what all goes into that, right? Into the institutionalization part. How do you speak the language of the government officials, and how do you then make, have this transition plan of making the program ownership shift over years, and how is that plan really thought through, and sort of even in terms of the value add of the conversations with researchers and the co-creation of these models and the subsequent iterations which are context specific. I think these are really realities that we see across programs, and it's great to see such partnerships come to fruition. I'm now going to invite Niriksha Shetty. So Niriksha, precision development really works at this intersection of technology, data science, research, which are all built into sort of the DNA of the organization. Can you tell us a little bit more about, how PXD works to embed evidence generation into your collaborations? It's a different sector, but I'm sure some of the same themes resonate. So I would love to hear from you.
Great. Thanks for having me, Sharanya. And I think, everything I've heard right now has really resonated, even though it's a completely different sector. I think a lot of the learnings and the takeaways are quite similar. So for PXD, we work on delivering digital agricultural advice to smallholder farmers. And, we were born out of a couple of randomized controlled trials that Michael Kramer and Sean Cole conducted. And then we decided to scale those based on the impact we saw on farmers. And very quickly, we realized, to what Abhijit was saying earlier, which is when you take something that has worked in like a super controlled environment and you scale something from a couple of thousand farmers to 1 million farmers, you really need to adapt and tweak that model for that much larger context. So I think PXD is interesting because we are testing, learning, iterating as we scale. So the idea is we're scaling and we're simultaneously generating evidence. And that, of course, comes with several challenges because you are then working with government partners who want to reach millions of farmers, but at the same time, you want to tweak this model and adapt it for that particular context. I think the second thing is, when we did these evaluations, the context continues to evolve from there. And so what has been really effective for us is partnering with other researchers, other organizations in continuing to also generate more evidence as a public good. So, we started out as a simple phone platform that just, communicated targeted advice to farmers in voice. But over the years, we've seen now a lot more farmers own smartphones. And so the idea is, how can we leverage those that own smartphones to gather information to improve the quality of advice, say, for everyone? And that's, an ongoing research question we're studying. The other thing I will add is I've often seen that government is, very willing to pay for service delivery, but there's a lot of what we call risk capital involved in, innovation, learning, testing and trialing, new methods. And that's where I think this other side of the ecosystem, which is donors that are willing to fund that, partners and researchers that are willing to work with you on it becomes very critical, because you need someone to put that upfront money in, fully acknowledging that this can fail, right? Like zero results are as important as, you know, us being able to detect impact. And so from our perspective, what has worked is trying to kind of facilitate this ecosystem of, say, a government partner that's willing to cover the service delivery costs, that's willing to cover the implementation costs at scale, but then also having donors that are willing to cover the, you know, evidence generation costs, having external researchers in place, having, you know, other partner organizations on the ground. I also agree with, you know, Abhijit's point of, you don't evaluate a product until it has gotten stable. And what we found quite interesting is, you know, we had a stable product, and then we took it to 1 million farmers, and now we're tweaking it a bunch, and then deciding kind of at what point is it stable enough to do another evaluation. And so, you know, the evidence kind of keeps building on it as you scale. And then finally, in terms of working, you know, with government, I think I agree with everything that's said. Communication is key, trust is key. But for us, what has been critical and completely non-linear is facilitating the institutionalization of our programs, right? So often, even when there's buy-in from the top, you have to really go in there, work with people day in and day out to create trust, to, you know, create champions for your services. And that involves, I think, a whole different skill set, a whole different team, you know, in addition to all the research and product work that we're doing. And that's, I think, a long drawn out process. It's often affected by things like, you know, the person you're working with is suddenly transferred and you have to like start from scratch. And so that's, I think, an ongoing process that's very critical. And, you know, I feel like sometimes it's kind of shadowed as compared to, you know, the evidence side of things. And I think we need to generate more learnings around how that works well and share that as well. I will stop there.
Thank you, Niriksha. I think this last point that you said on institutionalizing a culture of evidence-based decision-making and having teams who have that skill set, this is exactly, I mean, it totally resonates with sort of our experience as well at JPAL South Asia, where we are trying to forge these partnerships because, and I think, you know, you have to have that longer term view and then work with champions, but also then create consensus at different levels because, you know, that's how things work, and sort of then, you know, integrate at every level this evidence-based thinking, just the need for a data and evidence-based approach to whatever you look at. So through a combination of, say, capacity building, research, as well as, you know, partnerships supporting governments to scale up innovative and evidence-based programs. So this is totally something that I agree with. And I think very interestingly, you mentioned about this culture of testing, learning, iterating as you go along. So this is a unique aspect that you touched upon, which is also, and I think another powerful point that you mentioned is about the power of different partnerships. So the role of donors in at least catalyzing that seed funding for initial research, because that's sometimes very difficult. Because of exactly this, that you may find impact, you may not, and that openness and that that ability to take that risk is something that is very important as we go along. So thank you for these very, very, very valuable thoughts. I'm actually now going to move on to Mr. Tejveer. Mr. Tejveer, needless to say, policymakers play a key role in all of this, in catalyzing research into policy and action. And you have, you know, a unique place in development sector because sort of governments can reach people at scale. From your perspective, it'll be great if you can, you know, tell us how can governments collaborate with other actors to inform, you know, their policy decisions and thinking more broadly.
So thank you, Sharanya, for inviting me for this session. Very distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. Let me quickly begin by saying that my association, like Sharanya mentioned, with JPAL goes back to my earlier assignment in the National Academy of Administration, Missouri, so where we worked together. And JPAL was trying to embed a culture on appreciation of evidence in our young trainees who were training there. I'm happy that in April of 2017, JPAL entered into a partnership with the government of Punjab work on areas of mutual and collaborative interest. We are very privileged that Professor Abhijit Banerjee himself visited Chandigarh when the MOU was signed in the presence of our Finance Minister and the Chief Secretary. As you're aware, many state governments have been working with JPAL over the past many years, Tamil Nadu, Haryana, Rajasthan. But I'm very happy that our institutional arrangement has come good, though we started a little late, and we've covered some good ground. And I think this partnership has acquired a good momentum, and we hope that going forward we'll be doing even more meaningful work. On the contours of the partnership, as of now, JPAL has been working on some very interesting projects. A couple of them which definitely come to mind are this one on trying to incentivize savings for farmers in consuming less water. They've called the scheme Pani Bachao, Paisa Kamao. So that's a very interesting one. Even the World Bank is also running some similar pilots in different districts of Punjab. Then they are currently doing a project on examining the behavior of farmers on some sort of monetary incentives on reducing the burning of paddy straw, which is a huge issue for all of us in Punjab. They're also working on improving the outcomes in drug dependence treatment. So these are all very live policy problems for people in Punjab. In addition, they've also undertaken some training of officers in various departments in basic statistical appreciation and understanding really how the theory of change really works, and introducing them to the importance of evaluation besides the routine monitoring that goes on in government. We have a very good institutional arrangement to review the progress by a committee which is headed by the Chief Secretary, as senior officers of the government and JPAL officials, and sometimes some of their prominent researchers have also come and joined these meetings to share their insights with the state government. Now, how can government benefit with such collaboration? That's really the question for today. So like the speakers before me have spoken, I think firstly, it brings top-class economists and researchers who are working across the world to work in the state on issues which are high on any state government's agenda. Secondly, importantly, these partnerships help to embed a more analytical culture in the administration with focus on use of evidence. Now, very often decision makers tend to draw conclusions based on their opinions formed through their interactions and experiences with working in the field over the past many years, sometimes decades. Now, these conclusions are usually based on their intuition, which is again based on their experience, and they may well be right. But what if they are not right? Or what if they are wrong? Or these inferences are completely misplaced? So that is something where we need to have a greater sense of appreciation of evidence. And hopefully with doing this, we can also improve the design of our future interventions. So I think it's not just only about, it's really completing that entire loop to ensure that these evaluations, these RCTs, they help improve the design of policy interventions. Thirdly, today there are many problems in government which are in the nature of what people may call wicked problems, or those that defy easy solutions. Like I mentioned, affecting savings in the use of water in agriculture or not burning paddy straw. It is here that we all really need to put our minds together. And I personally feel from the state government side, we really need to welcome people who can contribute and help us solve some of these problems. So for instance, other than JPAL, I mean, in Punjab, we also set up about 2.5 years ago, a state advisory council comprising very eminent economists, policy experts, and others drawn from different fields, including even some of them who had worked on very high positions in the private sector. So just to get a nice, a fresh view on looking at various issues in the government. I think the acceptability to deal with experts in government is increasing. And though sometimes you all on the other side may have had, have encountered some pushback also, but I think all in all, it's getting far more positive than it was. So I just like to just share a small case in point, which I was just thinking last night as to what to say, and this came to my mind. It is a issue related to as trying to solve some problems on maternal mortality rate. Now, Punjab has a relatively high maternal mortality rate, which has been a cause for concern for health administrators, and it's relatively high given our fairly low IMR and good performance on other indicators. So obviously, it's a bit of a issue. Some years ago, the health department started incentivizing maternal deliveries in government health institutions at night. The general complaint, which probably was there at that time, that health staff were not available at night, and resultantly, patients had to go to either private hospitals or deliver non-institutionally, putting the mother and child at risk. So drawing upon ideas from current economic thinking, they started giving a cash incentive of rupees 3,000 under the National Health Mission to a team of five to six doctors and supporting staff for the C-section deliveries at night. Now, when I joined the state in 2017, I remember reading a story in the papers that in some government hospitals, almost 70% C-section deliveries were being done at night. Data for the corresponding period showed that in normal deliveries, over 60% deliveries were happening during the day, while more than 70% C-sections were happening in the night. Interestingly, between 4 p.m. and 8 p.m., that is the pre-night period, there were hardly any C-section deliveries in these hospitals. After reading these media reports, I remember speaking to officers in the health department that, have you seen this media report? So their answer was very, very defensive. They said, yes, sir. And they really thought that something seriously was going wrong. And they said that we've deputed a team of senior doctors to look at this and take corrective measures immediately. So what really one understood was this was a classical gaming response that was happening by agents in government. So like correcting a typical principal agent problem, there was a case probably for closer monitoring after properly analyzing the data, which very interestingly, the newspaper correspondent had done, identifying where really the problem lay. Was it happening across Punjab, or was it peculiar to certain places, or more in some places? Possibly setting some kind of time norms for deliveries, that once a patient is brought in, the C-section will happen in so much of time, so that patients and women don't have to wait in labor or till night to wait in labor. Also, there could have been a case for possibly reducing the monetary incentives to overcome some of the perversity which was showing and to curb this gaming, but yet provide a slightly reduced but required monetary incentive to encourage the desired behavior from the health staff. So I was thinking to myself, what can typically follow in government? So it could be any of these following things. There could be one, action against those who are indulging in gaming. After all, public funds are being put to possibly misuse. You could end up withdrawing the monetary incentive, which can often be the case, that you just, let's end this story here, this thing. Creating an audit para can get created for misuse of government funds. You can start an inquiry of recovery of this money from those who have taken that, and also possibly even an inquiry against the officers or the decision makers of the time who took that decision in giving a sort of a monetary incentive. So the point I'm just wanting to make is that we need to really think that while taking a decision on this issue, this small issue that presents itself, are we better off without this incentive, or taking any action, will it help achieve our policy objective? So I think when you are exposed to use and appreciation of evidence along with contemporary economic thinking that informs policy, as well as examples which have been successful in different parts of the country or even abroad, I think the chances are that we will all take better decisions and more informed decisions. So I think that's really the strength which partnerships like these bring to the state government. They help refine our thinking and hopefully can improve the quality of government interventions to solve problems which the people of the state may be facing. I'll end here for the moment.
Thank you so much, Mr. Tejveer. I think that's absolutely right. And from the other side, I can say at JPAL, we really value not only the partnership, but also the thought leadership that people like you are willing to engage with us to guide us as to, what are the priorities, what are some of the, core engagement areas, and what are some of the key gaps, which allows an ecosystem in which we are able to engage much better, bringing researchers, bringing NGOs, bringing a whole range of stakeholders, including donors, into the landscape of Punjab. And I think what you said in the end, absolutely, the evidence may be generated within Punjab or within whichever state at hand, like the Pani Bachao Paise Kamao co-created scheme that you were talking about to save groundwater as well as electricity, to understand whether it works or not, or it could be innovations from another state that are being scaled up currently in Punjab. For instance, the whole gender sensitization program, which was initially piloted, refined in Haryana, tested, created by NGO Breakthrough, and now Breakthrough is working with the government of Punjab, and JPAL is sort of doing a process evaluation of this. So, and this is a statewide scale up. So I think that's again an example where you don't have to reinvent the wheel by doing an entire evaluation if the context is similar enough, and we think that the results are going to be generalizable, and it's actually leading to a scale up of an evidence-based program at scale. So thank you so much. I think that's really, really valuable remarks from the evidence user side of things, which is the government at the end of the day. I'm now going to turn it over to Sukhmani. Sukhmani, from whatever you've heard, I think donors have a crucial role to play along this evidence to action funnel at different touch points to create this ecosystem, to ensure that the gaps are kind of met. So it'll be great to hear from you what your experience has been through Porticus to enable to create this role of a catalyst that often donors end up playing. So over to you.
Thanks so much, Sharanya. And it was wonderful to play the role of listening in really to the rest of the panelists. And I feel like there are several areas of overlap in thinking, which is very encouraging. So maybe, one step back for those who've not partnered with Porticus, we are an entity that was established to inform the philanthropy of one family, and we work in 4 areas. One is on the aspect of whole child development. Second is we work on issues of unsafe migration and criminal justice. We also work on climate action, and the family is Catholic, so we also work on fostering vital faith. In this specific era of Porticus, because it's been an entity that's been established for a while, we have pivoted from being, I think, a philanthropic entity to moving to strategic philanthropy. And one of our daring goals to ourselves has been, to have a proven contribution to positive impact in the majority of our endeavors. Easier said than done, but it has required a huge culture shift within Porticus to be a learning organization. And along with being a learning organization, we've had to put our goalpost in saying, what does change look like? And we've now, gathered around and agreed on the fact that we want to invest in endeavors that lead to systemic change. And for everybody, how we understand systemic change is just factors that hold the problem in place. And so working back from there and saying, how would change happen for it to be lasting, given all these different factors? So with systems change in mind, we think of evidence generation in lots of different ways. One is a more internal way, which is our own thematic strategies. These are formed by a lot of thought is put into and work into what is existing evidence base to inform our strategy. And this is easier when there's existing evidence. So for instance, on the aspect of employing whole child development approaches, there's evidence on its impact in terms of learning and ability of a child to thrive. But when it comes to larger topics and more complicated topics such as unsafe migration, we realize that this evidence base is still being developed. So to ensure that we're not locked in for too long, we also do a 3-year review of our strategies. And more externally, and this is where the majority of the work happens, is in figuring out partnerships that would enable or move this needle towards systems change. So, coming back to the topic of, or using the example of whole child development, a lot of the evidence comes from this field of neuroscience. And what partners in the field are doing, a lot of them are civil society partners, is translating that into development programs. And, and my colleagues on the panel have referred to this aspect of contextual, solutions. So when we look at partners, we look at both those who are looking at evidence and looking at innovations, but being able to iterate it on very contextual ways. We also recognize that for systems change to happen, we need different kinds of evidence. So at times you need evidence which is very thematic focused, but for system change, you need evidence that also speaks to some of these, more, I would say, packaged bets, which is the aspect of training. And this training, training of adults is something that happens across different governance structures. And there's evidence on what are practices that enable better adult learning or training than others. So these are things that you can pad, or we pad our outlook for systems change towards. And kind of in thinking through partners, we also think through a lot of operational mechanisms. One is doing like a systems review to understand opportunity. And, so that requires moving away from only intervention results. So moving away from only what has worked at an intervention level to assessing factors that hold the problem in place. So that means it's possible that when doing a systems review, that there are, structural work is already being done. Structural work in terms of policy practices are already in play, and there are stakeholders there. And so for an organization like Porticus, we would then be looking at ways of saying, okay, what is a value addition that we can add? Maybe there's work required to be done on aspects of relationship building, on aspects of building, changing behaviors and mindsets. So then you'll employ, approaches such as narrative building, which I know is another buzzword in the sector, but without making it one, I think everybody can agree that something Pranav also said, just evidence generation doesn't work. We know that we need messaging on evidence, which is bite-sized, which is, reaches the stakeholders we intend to, enables people to identify or agree on a problem, feel like they can act on it, and not be fatigued or be oblivious to it. So, equally for systems change, you need, in addition to just solutions and work, you also need to be thinking of these array of other solutions that exist. And I don't want to suggest that all of this happens seamlessly, or, that this is, an approach that looks better on a Word document. I think there are real challenges in doing that, because one thing is, for change to happen, we recognize that you need multiple approaches. At times, you also need multiple solutions on the table with an agreement around what is the goal or what is the outcome of change. And that, collective action, if you were to call it, is, tedious. It is difficult because you are bringing in very different stakeholders who at times, because of also funders are competitive in their approaches. So how do you bring them, align them on a platform for change that they would work towards together? So bringing people together at times is easier than enabling or providing space for collaboration. Time is another, I think it's the ticking time clock is a real factor in our work. How do you balance the urgency with change, right from government to civil society partners to actual people who are either, who are possibly not getting better services. There is a sense of urgency with which we have to work. But a lot of what is required is also collaboration, trust building, which takes time. So there's balancing factor between being biased to action while being understanding that for this change to happen, we need lots of people to own the problem or own the solution. And for that, trust is required. Building in that space, building in that muscle is something that we are actively learning about and actively listening to our partners who are trying these approaches. Finally, I think it'll be very, it wouldn't make sense if I don't talk about the role that funders play in this whole evidence field, recognizing that we play a role, recognizing that funders too should be held to account and have active dialogues of when does it make sense? Or when do you aid evidence in terms of taking space? When do you hold space for others? And when do you relent space? I think is something that will take us a longer way towards change. So I'm going to pause there and looking forward to your questions.
Thanks, Sukmani. I think those were a lot of, I mean, that's a lot to think about that you have shared, and in beautiful words. How do you own the problem? How do you own the solution? And at the same time, how can all of this guide strategic philanthropy? And what are the various touch points of the evidence to action funnel where it really makes sense for donors to intervene? And one thing that really resonated was when to come in and when maybe best to empower the respective stakeholders to take forward the agenda. I think that's equally important. So thank you for that. And now we'll go on to a short Q&A. This is going to be a moderated Q&A, and then we have a few questions from the audience. I know Mr. Tejveer has to leave for a Chief Minister's meeting shortly, so I'm going to first turn over to you, Mr. Tejveer, for a question, if that's okay by you. Thank you. So, as part of your position, you interact so closely with, top bureaucracy in Punjab, but also equally the political ecosystem, because through the role of, being PS to CM, so you interact closely with the Chief Minister's office. So given this sort of, dual interface, what are some of the most important facets? And these are just the two most important facets of decision making. So can you tell us a little bit about some of the challenges you may have encountered in balancing these two roles, mobilizing the government's machinery to complete, this evidence to policy action loop, which you feel strongly about, but what does it take to bring everybody on the same page and especially balance these two roles that you play?
So Sharanya, let me say that being posted with the Chief Minister as a staff officer, one has to really perform predominantly a coordination function, trying to share feedback that the Chief Minister receives from various sources to my colleagues in the government. Now, action really lies in the domain or the realm of departments concerned with their respective ministers in charge and their secretaries. So that's top down, but also similarly, there are certain good bottom-up ideas that keep getting generated within the government, which also require to be given traction to ensure their acceptability with the political executive. So I think this is a bit of a two-way process that goes on. And yes, you have to, there is obviously in governments, because governments are political, they've been elected by people. So you have to ensure that both these interests are balanced as a government takes decisions. Now, looking at what kind of challenges emerge, I think from a perspective as a civil servant, I think we all should be cognizant of a few basic things. Firstly, I think not all our proposals will always find acceptability with the political leadership. I remember when I was a student at LSE, about a decade ago, so our professor in policy analysis would always teach us that even more important than conducting economic analysis, whether you do cost benefit or cost effectiveness analysis, is really to analyze the political acceptability of your ideas. So in case if you have well-researched proposals which lack some sort of a face validity of sorts, they're not very likely to be accepted. So given this, what should we all do? So first is, I think we all must be armed with proposals and wait for the proverbial window of opportunity to present itself. Now, this is classical, public policy theoretical stuff, but I think it's really, really important. So in case if you are a good, committed civil servant who wants to make a difference, I think you should be ready with some bright ideas, well thought out, well analyzed, and just wait for the opportune time when you can steer the things in the right direction. And mind you, I think this window of opportunity keeps presenting itself fairly regularly in government. So there are times when the same idea will be accepted very quickly. There are other times when it will not be accepted. So I think it's good. Number one, good to wait for it. Second, I think it does help somewhat to understand the political imperatives of a government, and also to present proposals in a manner that they do not look necessarily offensive to the general public or to, in some ways, worsening their existing welfare, taking away certain subsidies, privileges, etc. So sometimes economists even call it some sort of reform by stealth or something, give it a more, a more interesting name. But I think this is also important. So I've seen that there are times when certain civil servants or certain ministers are able to do this part well. So sometimes their proposals go through, whereas others who come out a little more directly in the face, sometimes obviously face that pushback from people because they are obviously political actors who are cognizant of issues on the ground. Thirdly, and importantly, I think we should not let rejection demoralize us as civil servants. Now, all of you would agree that civil servants are generally risk averse, and hence they fear the ignominy of failure more than the excitement of a potential reward. That's what behavioral economists sometimes may like us to believe. But that should not really worry us. A useful metaphor is of big cats catching prey. When we see these, very nice movies on, Discovery or National Geographic, they would tell us that how a lion or a cheetah makes a kill after multiple failures, but then we never stop hunting, do we? So I think the real challenge for us in the civil service, who are a kind of as working as kind of advisors to the political executive, is to be fairly, have some views, let group of people inform our thinking and come up with good workable ideas and present them to the political executive. And hopefully, I think, wait for the right time where they will be picked up. My general experience is a good idea gets picked up when the time really comes. So I think I personally I'm quite sanguine about this.
Thank you so much, Mr. Tejveer. I think those are really valuable words of advice from somebody who's in the system and is constantly sort of working across all of these different touch points, engaging with the bureaucracy, engaging with the political ecosystem, but equally all of us as development stakeholders in this evidence to action mission. So thank you very much. I'm now actually going to turn it over to Niriksha. To elaborate a bit more, I think we've spoken about some solutions, spoken about the roles of different stakeholders, but what are some of the challenges in enabling all of this to happen, right? The road is not so smooth, and sort of, can you talk a little bit more about, at PXT, what are some of the common systemic challenges that emerge from the work that you have in bringing all of these stakeholders, aligning incentives of the partners that you work with?
Thanks, Sharanya. I think some of this has already been touched upon, but I think from our perspective, it's really, getting the evidence to the right people at the right time, which is, I guess, what this panel is all about. And it's often trying to meet people where they are, right? So if you are talking to a government partner, and I think Pranav said it's about pushing the idea, it's not about necessarily pushing your product. Something we've often seen is if you go in and say, here's a digital product, we want to scale it up, we think this can help you. Some of the feedback that often comes back is, we already have this other digital extension system. What are you going to do that's so different? Or why would I walk away from something that I've already invested a lot in? And so a lot of the communication is key, but it's also kind of trying to adjust and tweak your model, to kind of fit what the political priorities are in some situations. So what we often do is say, it doesn't need to be our product, but what we can offer is the ability to work with you to help improve your product. And can those tweaks, I think there's this like relationship building phase where the other party needs to appreciate you for the skills and offerings you build. And so it's trying to identify those opportunities, and it's almost like picking the lowest hanging fruit and getting started somewhere, which I think is quite critical. The other one is, and I think this is quite common to the work JPAL and others do, is as there is greater incentive and push to scale, you also then want to build in the space to do the impact evaluations and to try and learn from the work that you're doing. And I think, again, with that, it's communicating, it's trying to identify priorities, and it's trying to design evaluations in a way that are not, confrontational, so to say. So I think you have to recognize why scale is of priority without trying to compromise on the ability to generate evidence. And then the last thing I'll say is, there are some, there are incentives within the policy space to try and change the design of things, to tweak the settings, but it's quite hard to sometimes, there's path dependency. So it's quite hard to say, scrap this program, it doesn't work. And so it's trying to figure out where you intervene and where you share those learnings, that's quite important as well. And so I think Abhijit said this earlier, but it may not work in this context, but there are other organizations and partners and governments that would be willing to learn from those lessons. So it's really about how you communicate, and I think it's very nuanced in terms of how you build the trust and that relationship that's critical to making this succeed.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Niriksha. That was really helpful to know. I'm going to turn it over to Abhijit now to just elaborate a little bit. Abhijit, you shared, one successful example of how everything fell into place, but that's not always the case. And so can you talk a little bit more about, as a researcher, what are some of the challenges as well that you have met in working with partners, especially in an evolving implementation landscape or for any other reason? What are some of the issues that you have faced and how you may have overcome these as a researcher?
Thanks a lot for also all the insights that happened in the previous talks. I think to a large extent we try and design away from a lot of these problems, partly by sort of selecting partners that we can trust in this journey. Partly to go back to the points that Mr. Tejveer was just raising, right? Especially if you're going to work with government, there needs to be, at least in principle, a pathway to scale, because certainly across all state governments, there are far too many pilots, and there's far too little bandwidth for senior policymakers. Right, so it takes roughly as much attention from them to do something in 50 schools as it does to do it in 5,000, because the time that, say, a principal secretary of education has to think about any one particular intervention is kind of fixed. Right, so at least in principle, there should be the promise of, if this works out at this stage, this is what things would look like in 5 years' time. Right, so that's one. We've actually typically had pretty good relations with implementing partners. I think one challenge in working with governments, so there's a couple of challenges, I think, in working with governments that are worth thinking about. One is that, as with all implementing organizations, eventually it boils down to having the right champions in the right place. But, governments change, but also more frequently than governments change, the relevant officers can change. Right? So quite often, the coordination has been with one set of officials, and right after a government change, everybody in the entire department could shift. So one of the things that we try and do is make sure that, especially if an evaluation is starting to go, that we're not restricting our engagement with the government to just the principal secretary level, or even like 3 levels down. You want to make sure at least some of your connection is with departmental staff who will not shift. Right, and that helps with some kind of institutional memory. And then the last bit is that, especially if you're trying to do policy evaluations at scale, I think you just have to live with the fact that there is a certain amount of uncertainty involved in whether the intervention will happen, and that uncertainty exists even if everyone is well disposed to it in the system. So the extreme version would be that the pandemic could happen and schools could just close for a year and a half, right? That nobody can help. But smaller things happen in states all the time. So things like not insisting on a baseline all the time, right? Which is against the instinct of all evaluation people, but makes great deal of sense when trying to randomize large programs, because what you want to do is you want to randomize, and you want to maybe collect double the sample at the end line once you're sure that the intervention actually did occur, because there's only so many times you can go to funders and say, we did a really expensive baseline, but the thing didn't happen. So here's a cross section, and and we've spent all your money, but there's nothing that you will get out of this for the purpose. So I think some amount of flexibility there ends up mattering a lot.
Thank you so much, Abhijit. I think we've seen lots of audience questions trickling in as well. So maybe we can move to some audience questions now with everyone's permission. So I think one is, when it comes to research, what are some of the factors that determine the objectives and the question of that research? So requesting anybody to take this. I think some of this we've already touched upon, but it'll be great if any one of the panelists could take this.
Okay, I can take a stab, at least like in terms of, as researchers, how do we approach it? I think the first part is just defining outcomes. It's actually staggering how many programs, if you really push the teams, you're like, okay, no, tell me what metric you would want to change if everything about the program worked as you intended to. So I think that's exactly the first set of things. At least in the work that, say, I've been doing over the last, 7-8 years with various co-authors, it's frequently some version of, would this work in terms of changing these particular outcomes if everything happened the way that the implementers intended to? And then the second part, would anyone else be able to do this program, even if it was successful? And I think the second part is fairly important if you ever want it to scale. And that relates to exactly the kind of things that, say, Pranav was talking about costs, which is that we know that if EI is running a center out of school in Delhi, that this will work. It's a completely different magnitude and kind of challenge to say, can this work in standard government of Rajasthan schools? And then, I mean, the EI team's been trying to do this in all kinds of geographies across the country since. So yeah, that's how I would define it for programs that I've been working on.
Thank you, Abhijit. The next question is for Sukhmani around systems change. I'm going to paraphrase it a bit, but basically, this is ambitious. And so how do you really break this down and actually ensure that you move the needle on systems change and don't sort of just, as you said, don't let it just remain on paper? So I think that's one of the questions from the audience.
An attempt at answering that. We also look forward to hearing from others on the panel, because systems change is a big beast. I don't think people have cracked how systems change happens. There are lots of intelligent bets on how it will happen, and even assessing systems change is quite an enormous task. But at the same time, I think the motivation of thinking about systems change is because it's the realization and hopefully humility that goes into understanding that it's not that bright idea will change our lives, is not how people work, is not how ideas take root. That's the motivation. And realizing that even if you have a great idea, but nothing else changes in terms of people, personnel, behaviors, relationships, it will not stay for too long, even if it stays. So that's the purpose. But then how do you not wait for, given that how dynamic the sector is and everything that's mentioned, even from COVID to governments changing or individuals within the government changing. I think what we've been discussing a lot is about not putting all the eggs of your basket of evidence on just impact. So, diversify your portfolio of evidence generation. This can be lots of different things. So one is at this, what stage of the intervention are you at? Are you at an earlier stage? Maybe what you benefit from is better process evaluations. That's still evidence. If your outcomes of change are very nebulous, so empowerment, agency, these are difficult concepts. Think about, looking beyond just quantitative measures. There's some very solid qualitative approaches towards measuring these changes and capturing these stories, which are equally important. I mean, there's lots been written about what works in terms of changing people's perception for problems. Numbers are important, but at times stories and done, captured not as just case studies of what works the best, not cherry picking stories, but having really good qualitative evaluations enables people's ability to change and understand what a lot of times quantitative evaluation may not be able to answer on the why, on the how. So for me, it's really thinking through that puzzle and saying we need different kinds of evidence at different periods of time, and having a bouquet of almost solutions and evidence, because you know what, the best case scenario and also a thorny case is when governments don't wait for evidence to scale up, right? Like, you know, you have a politician who's like, that's a brilliant idea, I want to go for it. And meanwhile, you've only done your baseline, right? And so everybody, you know, the researchers on the project and funders will be like, that's not proven, but opportunity, of course, you're going to dance to that. So what do you have in that interim even to make yourself as an organization aware of what are the kinks in your armor, what are things that work really well? Like thinking through that is how I'd respond.
Thanks, Sukmani. There's a question on interdisciplinarity. So engaging the community and coming up with tailor-made solutions, both on the, this goes to both the research teams, but equally implementation from the implementation side. So requesting any of the panelists, Pranav, would you like, Pranav or Niriksha, would you like to take a stab at this?
I'm happy to. I think it's very critical to incorporate user research into the process. So, you know, there's all these buzzwords around user research, human-centered design. I think that at the core of it, and I don't view this as an economist versus everybody else question, because I think most economists would, you know, very happily integrate these techniques and are looking increasingly at multidisciplinary approaches. But from our perspective, you know, it's not just about what are the interventions you can test and, you know, how do you keep tweaking this model more quantitatively. But at the core of it, you know, if you believe that you're designing a product that is tailored to the individual, to be able to do that well, you need to understand what is it that the individual wants or what is their learning level. And so I think core to our process is at each stage of the program is trying to incorporate feedback from the users. So, you know, whether it's small things of, if we design 5 versions of a message, we'll actually take it out into the field and ask, you know, groups of farmers to provide feedback. And I think there's lots of interesting learning there, right? Because someone who owns a smartphone may have very different perspectives of like what's useful versus, you know, a marginal farmer who has barely any numeracy. And so I think it's very important to actually integrate that process even before sometimes you get to the testing stage, because the user research, you know, incorporating these different types of approaches is almost critical to getting to a point of building that stable product that you know want to test and learn and evaluate from. And at different stages, there are different methods you can deploy that are both qualitative and quantitative. So I think they're very much complementary.
Thank you. Pranav, would you like to add to that?
I think overall what I'm you know hearing from many people who are implementing is like, let's say, conversations on development impact bonds or impact evaluations, and they sometimes think it's a ticket to fundraising, right? But not realizing that in all such cases the results will be published and discussed, and so it's important that they form a culture of evaluating impacts early on. And you know, the path to getting an ID Insight or a JPAL or a 3IE or any of these evaluation is I would say it's whatever, almost like a final one. So one can always start this internally. Not everything has to be gold standard RCTs done by third party. You could literally have your own baseline inline. You can find a control group and you can start looking at that data, and maybe you can have a separate monitoring and evaluation team that is not biased, as opposed to an implementation team that's always thinks they're doing the best they can. And the data and the insights you get from that should keep improving your version 2 and version 3 of deployment. And as sort of that gets refined, the ask to a donor for a rigorous evaluation can keep going up. So So I think that is a point that's often missed because people always think that it's an all or nothing. But start with the lowest cost internal house team on impact evaluation of your intervention. Always have a control group. If you wish, have 2 or 3 different treatment arms. And also hold yourself to the outcomes that matter. Like a lot of time, people think of intermediate outputs. So in education, for example, sometimes it's hard for people to keep a eye on reading and math literacy outcomes, or let's say social emotional learning is coming up, and people get caught up with teacher behaviors or excuses like, what can I do in a government system that's plagued by bureaucracy? The game is that if finally a child is not happy or learning how to read and do math, that's still your baby, right? And your intervention has to move the needle on those outcomes. I mean, it's people don't like to hear that, but ultimately, we are going to move to a world where the emphasis on outcomes, regardless of intermediate struggles, is going to be there. So the earlier one starts on that journey, the farther they will get there. Yeah. Thanks, Shravanya.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Pranav. I'd like to thank all the panelists because I think it's been a really, really engaging discussion. And I think a lot of food for thought. If I were to summarize, I don't even want to begin to summarize, but I'll attempt to summarize some of the thoughts that everybody discussed. I think, of course, we are acknowledging that this evidence to policy pathway is not linear, is essential, but not linear. There are things to think about on each of these sort of across the funnel. There are lots of things to think about. The need for partnerships, I think this came across the board, the need for forging partnerships at all levels. Abhijit spoke about not only, at the top levels of bureaucracy, but sort of at different points in time, even at the middle levels of bureaucracy with a particular department or whatever be the case. It's important to have multi-layered partnerships and multi-sectoral partnerships and across different stakeholders, be it donors, policymakers, practitioners, researchers, or research facilitators. And sort of that was one thing, the importance of donors, especially at the initial stages, to provide seed funding to give, catalyze evidence and innovation. So what both Abhijit and Pranav spoke about, there could be innovations in the NGO and private ecosystem that can then be taken up and scaled if they are found impact. But who supports that initial research, especially, right? Which is something very important. The trust and openness, the importance of sort of having these policy research dialogues really at the outset to understand if you're asking the right problem, and then going after that to design solutions that are co-created, that are sort of bringing in the users as an important equation at that level. And what Mr. Tejveer Singh said, really looking at failures as an opportunity, and that openness really right from the start is super important, and not looking at failures as something that was a mistake. And then, of course, looking at working with governments is sort of really important, and that came across from across the board, where economies of scale, needless to say, and how can you really support at various points. So when you look at scale, once that evidence is generated, what are the sort of things that you have to think about? So that requires constant iteration, that requires a hand-holding plan, that requires systematically thinking about perhaps scaling up the idea and having buy-in from within the government and various stakeholders for that. Otherwise, it will not sustain across time. And sort of that, then what Niriksha said about, it's not just about a one-time evidence generation exercise. It's about constant testing, learning, iteration to arrive at those feedback loops when you talk about scale. We spoke about institutionalizing evidence-based decision-making by developing institutions. The stage we spoke a lot about this, about how do you develop systems to ensure that evidence is an important component of decision making, and it's not just ideology or intuition based culture, and how does that happen at different levels of both the bureaucracy but equally the political ecosystem? How do you Sukhmani spoke about messaging on evidence. It's not only about the evidence, but it's also about how that is communicated, how that is messaged at different levels. And so that was also a very interesting thought, and really expanding our understanding of evidence. What is evidence, right? And how can you bring in the different types of evidence based on the need and context of that, and again, what is the role of donors in all of this? Where do they need to come in to fill in gaps? What is strategic philanthropy? How do you create systems change, which is not just the mandate of one stakeholder, but really an ecosystem building exercise, which requires the coming together of all of these entities to ensure that this research to action funnel is really sort of met. So I think those were really interesting thoughts, and a lot more was discussed, but I think thank you so much for giving us your time and for so openly sharing your thoughts. Really appreciate it. And I think I really learned a lot from this discussion, and hope all of you did so too. Over to you, Ashrita.
Great, thank you so much, Sharanya. And I would like to thank all the esteemed speakers in your panel. I thoroughly enjoyed your session, and I have to say this was so much to learn from here. And specifically that this resonates with Campbell South Asia so much that we have been working on increasing the use of policy and uptake of evidence into policy from Campbell reviews and maps in India and South Asia. And we do understand that the success of evidence to policy mainly depends particularly on how we communicate with the policymakers and how we understand each other's interest in terms of moving from typically what works in terms of to why something works and in what context, and of course how they work together to focus the scope of the reviews and research teams in playing active roles in terms of disseminating the findings of review to policymakers in the simplest forms. So we do understand, when we go to the policymakers, having long pages, like 20 pages, systematic reviews, that's never going to work out. So we need to, disseminate these information in the simplest form. And just to finally add that with every sectors, there are a lot of challenges, but what your panel helped us understand is in terms of building this relationship for others and learning from your success stories. So I really look forward to build on our relationships and learn further from your success stories to actually make this happen for Camel South Asia as well. So I would really like to thank you again and all the esteemed speakers in your panel. Sharanya, it was really, really, really thought-provoking session for us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ashrita, and thank you everyone for joining the session.
Great. So next up, we have the panel sessions. So for this day one, we have two panel sessions today with themes on evidence on governance and accountability. And the second theme is evidence for development in industries, commerce, and trade sectors. So you're free to join the session of your choice, and you can select the relevant breakout rooms. I think Yashika must have opened the breakout rooms by now. You can also move in between different sessions if one of them closes early, and if you would like to hear the next session as well, you can do that. And
Welcome everybody. We're just waiting a minute while we sort out the logistics, getting everyone in the room where they want to be. So please be patient for a moment.
Sure.
There's quite a few people not assigned yet to a new room. We're still working on that.
I was in a room, my own room that I'm chairing the session for, and then I was somehow brought back here automatically. So I don't know what's going on.
All
Are you
rooms
chairing
are
out the
open
session?
now. All rooms are open now. Please join.
Is this a room or is this a general session? Ashika.
Right now, everyone is in journal session.
This is not a room.
There are room evidence on governance and accountability and evidence for
Okay.
development.
So you have to scroll down the list and then I can join. It's only only 2 people in my. Okay, got it.
Please. Thank you.
Ramona, your room is named as evidence on governance. Yeah. Monisha, please join a room. You are not in the room yet. This is the main session. Monisha, Dakshin, and I request everyone to please select the room of their choice and be there in 2 rooms.
I'm unable to do that. Could you please guide me to it?
Yeah, okay, I'll send it. Just one.
Hello.